In an age when kings ruled from palaces and generals commanded from afar, one man chose to be both. Frederick of Prussia, soldier, philosopher, and sovereign, stood at the crossroads of intellect and power, shaping Europe's destiny with disciplined hands and restless ambition. Welcome to Biography Frontline. Tell us where you are listening from and subscribe as we explore the life of Frederick the Great. The story begins in the heart of early 18th century Europe, a continent divided by wars of succession and the balance of empires. In the north, the Kingdom of Prussia was still young, a disciplined, rising power shaped by duty, austerity, and the unyielding will of its ruler, Frederick William III. This was not yet the Grand Prussia of later centuries, but a modest and hard-won state whose strength lay in order, labour, and faith. In this climate of rigour and expectation, a child was born who would one day alter the fate of Europe. On January 24, 1712, in the royal city of Berlin, a prince was delivered to the house of Hohenzollern. The newborn was named Friedrich after his grandfather, but the man he would become would far exceed the name. His father, Frederick William I, was known to his people as the Soldier King, a man of simple habits, boundless energy, and uncompromising discipline. His mother, Queen Sophia Dorothea of Hanover, was of English descent, daughter of the Elector, who would later ascend the British throne as George I. Thus the infant prince stood between two worlds, the stern militarism of Prussia and the cultivated grace of Hanoverian England. The Berlin of that time was not a city of brilliance or ease. It was a fortress capital, austere in appearance and purpose. Streets were narrow and crowded with soldiers. The rhythm of life was set by the beat of drums and the measured step of the guard. Frederick William's court was a place of obedience rather than splendour. The king despised luxury and display. He demanded service, simplicity, and constant labour. Within his walls, all idleness was condemned. The young prince's first world, therefore, was one of strict routine, an environment of early rising, plain food, and the sound of orders shouted across courtyards. In such surroundings, childhood itself became a kind of discipline. The king's servants were soldiers, and his courtiers officers. He raised his family as he ruled his army, with rigid precision and unbending will. From the age of 5, Frederick was dressed in a miniature uniform and trained to march, salute, and obey. Play was limited and laughter often frowned upon. His toys were muskets and drums. Even his tutors were chosen for their severity rather than their gentleness. Every gesture of affection was tempered by instruction. Yet beneath this stern upbringing lay a nature not easily subdued. The young Frederick was intelligent, sensitive, and inclined toward reflection. He learned languages quickly and displayed an early love for music. When others heard only the rhythm of drums, he heard the harmony of flutes. When his father praised the virtue of obedience, the son began to imagine the virtue of understanding. It was not rebellion yet, but it was a difference of soul. And in Prussia, difference could be dangerous. By the time Frederick was 10, his education had taken on a shape that mirrored his father's vision for the nation. Lessons in theology, arithmetic, and geography were accompanied by long hours of drill and inspection. The boy was expected to memorize military regulations as others might recite poetry. But Sophia Dorothea, his mother, provided a quiet refuge from this relentless order. In her chambers, the tone softened. There, the French language was spoken, books of philosophy were read, and talk turned to art and culture. To young Frederick, these hours were a window into another world, a world of conversation, curiosity, and grace. It was through her that he discovered the writings of Voltaire and the poetry of Racine, though such pursuits would later provoke his father's wrath. The court, divided between these two temperaments, often echoed with tension. Frederick William's temper was fierce, and his expectations absolute. He sought to form in his son the ideal Prussian officer, obedient, frugal, and fearless. But Frederick's mind was drawn instead to ideas, melody, and meaning. Each day's routine became a contest between duty and desire, and though the boy obeyed outwardly, inwardly, he began to form his own judgment of power and its burden. At 12, he witnessed his first military parade from the royal balcony. The long lines of soldiers dressed in blue and white moved as one body under the winter sun. The drums rolled, muskets gleamed, and his father watched in satisfaction. Frederick, standing beside him, saw more than precision. He saw discipline as both strength and confinement. It was a moment that would stay with him, a vision of the state as machine and the soldier as its living part. Beyond the palace, the world was shifting. The War of the Spanish Succession had redrawn borders and tested alliances. The great powers, France, Austria, Britain, and Russia, jostled for influence across Europe. Prussia, though small, sought to rise among them through efficiency and arms. The Hohenzollern dynasty's ambitions depended on this young heir. Frederick's education, therefore, was not his own but that of the state. He was being prepared not for happiness, but for usefulness. During these years, his tutors noted his keen intellect and prodigious memory. He could recall entire passages of classical works and discuss the campaigns of Caesar or Gustavus Adolphus with insight beyond his age. Yet when conversation turned to obedience and piety, his answers grew hesitant. Some later wrote that he learned to conceal his thoughts, to preserve his mind behind a mask of politeness. In the royal household, silence could be a form of survival. The king's temper was legendary. A misplaced word or hesitant salute could provoke rage. Frederick's siblings too lived under this shadow, but none so acutely as the crown prince. Frederick William loved his son, but feared his softness. To him, sensitivity was weakness, and intellect without discipline was decay. He often struck the boy, sometimes in public, declaring that sentiment was the enemy of strength. These humiliations left scars that would never fully heal. In later years, observers would note that Frederick's composure, his habit of restraint, and his coolness under pressure were born from these early trials. He learned not to react, not to reveal emotion, a habit that later gave him a commander's clarity and a philosopher's detachment. The harshness of his youth became in time the steel of his character. By 1713, when the old king, Frederick the Great, died, the young prince's world changed. His father ascended as Frederick William III, and the full machinery of military rule began to shape Prussia into a new kind of state. The court was stripped of ornament, taxes were redirected to the army, and all who served the crown were judged by usefulness alone. For the young Frederick, now heir apparent, the expectations grew even heavier. He would not only be the king's son, but the future embodiment of Prussian virtue. In these early years, the outlines of two destinies could already be seen: the father's dream of a perfect soldier king, and the son's vision of a ruler guided by reason. Between them stretched a lifetime of conflict, reconciliation, and transformation. The prince, still a child, could not yet know the extent of his inheritance, an inheritance not of comfort or peace, but of struggle and responsibility. And thus, in the disciplined silence of the Berlin Palace, the story of Frederick the Great began, not with victory, but with the quiet formation of endurance. The early years of Frederick's life unfolded beneath the strict eye of a father who believed that discipline was the truest expression of love. Frederick William I, known across Europe as the Soldier King, ruled his household as he ruled his army, with order, precision, and the expectation of complete obedience. To his mind, every gesture, every word, every thought of his children must serve the greater purpose of duty. Play was wasteful, imagination suspect, and refinement a form of weakness. It was in this atmosphere that the young prince's character was forged, not in comfort or affection, but in the constant presence of fear and scrutiny. The palace was less a home than a barracks. Servants moved briskly, their voices low, as if the very air were subject to command. The days began at dawn with prayers, drills, and instruction. Even meals were rituals of silence and observation. The king sat at the head of the table, his gaze sharp, his temper unpredictable. A careless movement or a whisper of disobedience could end in harsh words or public humiliation. Frederick learned early that to survive, one must listen more than speak and endure more than resist. It was a lesson that would later define his composure under the pressures of war. His father's vision of kingship was rooted in austerity. Frederick William believed that splendour corrupted rulers, that luxury was the seed of ruin. He wore plain uniforms, ate simple food, and despised courtiers who flattered or idled. The young Frederick, however, inherited a different temperament. From his mother, Sophia Dorothea, he received a sensitivity foreign to the Prussian temperament, a love of art, poetry, and the gentler graces of life. She sought to soften her son's world, introducing him to French manners, literature, and the refined intellect of the Enlightenment. In her private chambers, away from the echo of boots and orders, Frederick discovered the works of Corneille and Molière, and above all, Voltaire, whose sharp wit and rational philosophy fascinated him. It was here that the boy's imagination found its first refuge, a fragile world of melody and thought that contrasted with the harshness of his father's domain. But such influences did not remain hidden for long. The soldier king, suspicious of anything French, anything that smacked of intellect over obedience, soon discovered his son's secret interests. Books were confiscated, instruments destroyed, and tutors dismissed. Frederick was forbidden from speaking French in his father's presence. To the king, these things were symptoms of weakness. To the son, they became symbols of inner freedom. This conflict of spirit deepened as Frederick grew. He was intelligent, eloquent, and curious, yet every attempt to express himself invited reprimand. His father wished for a soldier. He had raised a thinker. The clash between the two became the rhythm of their relationship, oscillating between anger and uneasy reconciliation. When Frederick showed skill in command or discipline, the king's approval was brief and restrained. When he displayed sensitivity or intellect, punishment followed. There are accounts of the king striking his son in public, dragging him by the hair before astonished courtiers. On one occasion, he forced the young prince to watch as his beloved flute was broken in two. These acts were not merely expressions of temper, they were deliberate lessons in authority. Frederick William sought to crush all traces of gentleness, to replace them with the hardness he believed a monarch required. Yet paradoxically, the more he punished his son's spirit, the more he taught him self-control. The young Frederick learned to conceal his thoughts, to endure humiliation without visible reaction, to master emotion through reason. Beneath the appearance of submission, his mind grew sharper, calculating, and detached. He began to understand that power was not only in command, but also in restraint. Prussia itself mirrored this tension between rigidity and awakening. The nation was small, enclosed by larger powers, its survival dependent on order and discipline. Every citizen, from farmer to noble, was part of the king's vision of a perfect state, self-sufficient, obedient, and strong. The army was its heart. Boys were trained from childhood to drill with precision. Officers rose by merit as much as by birth. It was a society where individuality meant little, and the collective good was sacred. Within this framework, Frederick's early rebellion was not only personal, it was philosophical. He began to question whether strength required suppression, or whether a state might also be guided by knowledge and justice. These were dangerous thoughts in a court where obedience was the only virtue. Still, they remained with him, quietly forming the foundation of the ruler he would become. Despite the severity of his youth, Frederick's mind expanded rapidly. His education in languages, Latin, Greek, and French, was advanced for the time. He absorbed history, philosophy, and military science with equal zeal. But what distinguished him was not the breadth of his knowledge, but the depth of his reflection. When he studied the campaigns of Alexander or Caesar, he did not merely memorize maneuvers. He sought to understand motive, timing, and the balance between risk and necessity. His curiosity was practical, not idle. He was learning, even then, how power operated, not in isolation, but in the minds of men. Music offered him another kind of discipline. The flute, to him, was not merely an escape, but a structured art, governed by precision and balance, the same qualities his father demanded in the army, expressed through harmony instead of command. In this paradox, Frederick found unity between his nature and his destiny. The household tension deepened as he reached adolescence. The king's anger grew sharper, his disappointment more open. He accused Frederick of cowardice, of softness, of neglecting the true purpose of his birth. The prince, in turn, began to see his father as a tyrant rather than a guide. Conversations became confrontations. Each word, each silence, carried the weight of unspoken defiance. Yet beneath this struggle lay a strange bond. Both men shared an intensity of purpose, though expressed in opposite ways. The father sought to build a state of iron. The son would later forge it into an empire of intellect and discipline. But for now, reconciliation seemed impossible. The young Frederick's isolation deepened, and his desire for escape, intellectual or physical, grew stronger with each passing year. It was during this period that he formed a close friendship with Hans Hermann von Katter, a young officer of charm and education. Together, they shared music, philosophy, and dreams of a life beyond the confines of Prussia. The bond between them was sincere, though it would later become the cause of tragedy. Through Katter, Frederick glimpsed the possibility of freedom, a life of conversation, art, and thought unburdened by command. But the walls of Berlin were high, and his father's spies vigilant. What began as youthful longing would soon turn to desperate action. The seeds of rebellion had been sown. The palace, with its silent corridors and echoing discipline, could not contain the restless energy of a mind yearning for light. Frederick's outward obedience masked an inner decision. He would one day break from his father's control, whatever the cost. The story of the Crown Prince, once merely that of a son under a stern father, was becoming the story of a spirit in conflict with authority itself. The lessons of fear would shape the lessons of command. The pain of submission would one day become the clarity of leadership. The boy who had learned silence would soon find his voice, not in words, but in action. In the quiet hours of early morning, when the palace lay still and the sound of marching feet faded beyond the gates, the young Crown Prince found solace in secrecy. He would retreat to his chamber, a small refuge filled with forbidden things. French books bound in fine leather, sheet music copied by hand, and a silver flute hidden carefully from sight. There he entered a world that was his own, a world shaped by melody, language, and the liberty of thought. The flute, delicate and precise, became his voice, while the writings of Voltaire and Bayle spoke to his intellect with a candour no tutor dared express. Through them, Frederick encountered a new idea of humanity, one that valued reason over obedience, inquiry over tradition, and the dignity of the mind over the authority of birth. It was a revelation as intoxicating as it was dangerous, for in the kingdom of his father, independent thought was not a virtue, but a provocation. The Palace of Berlin in those years was a fortress of discipline. Every day followed a fixed order of inspection, parade, and devotion. The king demanded punctuality and punished indifference. Yet within that rigid rhythm, Frederick began to weave an inner counterpoint of reflection and art. His fascination with French culture grew into a quiet rebellion. He wrote letters in French, composed short pieces for the flute, and studied the philosophical works that circulated among the scholars of Europe's salons. His sister, Wilhelmina, shared his tastes and became his confidant. Together, they mocked the coarse manners of the court and dreamed of a life in which beauty and intellect might coexist with power. The correspondence between them reveals the young prince's yearning for refinement and his growing contempt for the coarseness of the military world that surrounded him. "My only pleasure," he once wrote, "lies in my flute and my books. Everything else is torment." This inner life was not without risk. His father regarded all such interests as corruption, the mark of foreign decadence undermining Prussian virtue. To love French literature was to betray German strength. To favour music was to turn from the seriousness of duty. When the king discovered Frederick's small circle of cultured friends and the secret gatherings in which they read and discussed forbidden texts, his anger was fierce and immediate. Books were seized, instruments smashed, and the young prince confined under guard. Tutors who had encouraged his curiosity were dismissed in disgrace. Frederick was reminded with the full force of royal authority that he belonged to the state before he belonged to himself. But repression could not undo what had already taken root. The prince's mind, awakened to freedom, could not return to ignorance. He became more careful, more guarded, yet his intellect deepened in secret. He began to write small essays of reflection, meditations on morality, politics, and the nature of power. These were not the writings of a boy, but of a young man seeking order within conflict. He explored the paradox of authority, the necessity of command, and the danger of tyranny. To rule others, he wrote privately, one must first learn to rule oneself. Such thoughts, born in confinement, would later form the moral structure of his reign. Outside the palace walls, Europe was changing. The Enlightenment was spreading from Paris to the courts of the continent. Philosophers questioned the divine right of kings and proposed that rulers should govern through reason and justice rather than fear. Ideas that would one day transform nations were now carried quietly across borders in letters and manuscripts. Frederick, still a prince but already a thinker, absorbed these currents with fervour. He saw in them not only liberation for the mind, but also a new vision of kingship, one that united intellect with responsibility. The contrast with his father could not have been starker. Frederick William saw the king as a servant of God's order. Frederick saw him as a servant of the public good. The difference would define not only their relationship, but also the evolution of the Prussian state. The young prince's friendship with Hans Hermann von Katte deepened during this period of growing tension. Katte was everything Frederick admired: cultured, thoughtful, and sympathetic. The two shared a bond that went beyond mere companionship. They studied music together, wrote verses, and spoke of philosophy with the confidence of youth. In Katte, Frederick found understanding. In Frederick, Katte found purpose. Their friendship became a sanctuary against the storm of the royal household. Yet such intimacy could not remain unnoticed. The king's spies reported every conversation, every letter exchanged, every hint of dissent. The soldier king's suspicion hardened into fury. He saw in Katte's influence not friendship, but corruption, not trust, but conspiracy. By the late 1720s, the relationship between father and son had deteriorated beyond repair. The prince had been humiliated before the court, confined to his quarters, and stripped of dignity. His requests to travel or study abroad were denied. The dream of freedom, both intellectual and personal, grew desperate. It was then that Frederick and Katte conceived a plan that would change their lives forever. They would flee Prussia. They would cross the border into England, where Frederick's uncle, King George II, might offer refuge. There, far from the reach of the soldier king, the crown prince could live as he pleased, a free man among enlightened minds. It was a plan born of hope, but shadowed by danger, for in Prussia, flight from royal authority was treason. The preparations were cautious, but not invisible. Letters were sent, routes traced, and sympathisers quietly enlisted. Yet secrecy, in a court built on surveillance, was fragile. A careless word from a servant, a rumour repeated by an officer, and the plan was betrayed. The king was informed of his son's intention. His response was swift and merciless. Frederick was arrested while travelling with his regiment near the Rhine. Katter was seized soon after. The young prince, not yet 20, was brought before his father in chains. What followed was a confrontation remembered for its violence and sorrow, the collision of two natures bound by blood, yet divided by conviction. In that meeting, Frederick William's rage exploded. He struck his son, shouting that he would rather see him dead than dishonoured. Witnesses recalled the scene with horror, the king trembling with fury, the son pale but silent. Frederick was dragged away to imprisonment in the fortress of Kustrin. Katter, condemned as an accomplice, was sentenced to death. The tragedy that followed would mark the end of Frederick's youth and the beginning of his transformation. From this point forward, he would learn that freedom, for one born to rule, was never granted. It had to be earned through suffering, patience, and the mastery of self. The year 1730 marked the moment when youthful defiance turned into irreversible consequence. The Crown Prince, weary of humiliation and longing for freedom, had made the fatal choice to flee the kingdom that would one day be his own to rule. Frederick's plan, conceived in secrecy and desperation, was not the act of a reckless boy, but of a man suffocating under tyranny. Every beating, every public rebuke, every confiscated book had deepened his resolve to escape his father's control. To him, flight seemed not betrayal, but survival, the only way to preserve his dignity and his mind. Yet in the rigid order of Prussia, where obedience was sacred and desertion a mortal sin, such a decision could only lead to tragedy. Frederick and his companion Hans Hermann von Katter had hoped to cross into the safety of England, where Frederick's uncle reigned and where the culture of liberty and reason flourished. There, the prince dreamed of studying, of writing, and perhaps of beginning a life unshadowed by his father's rage. They planned carefully, but not cunningly enough. Suspicion had already taken root in the royal household. Informants watched every movement of the Crown Prince, and whispers of discontent travelled swiftly to the soldier king's ear. When Frederick left with his regiment on manoeuvres near the Rhine, the opportunity for escape seemed at last within reach. But fate and the machinery of a vigilant monarchy intervened. Letters were intercepted. The commandant of Kustrin was alerted. Before the plan could unfold, Frederick was seized and placed under guard. The betrayal was complete. The king's fury knew no bounds. To him, his son's attempted flight was not merely disobedience, but treason, an act that dishonoured the crown, the army, and the very principles upon which Prussia stood. He ordered Frederick brought before him, not as a prince, but as a criminal. Witnesses later spoke of the confrontation as one of terrifying intensity. Frederick William struck his son repeatedly, shouting that he would rather see him dead than cowardly. Soldiers stood frozen, uncertain whether to intervene. Frederick, pale and trembling, did not resist. In that silence, the gulf between father and son became absolute. No argument, no plea could bridge the divide between the king who worshipped discipline and the prince who sought freedom through thought. Frederick was imprisoned in the fortress of Kustrin, his rank stripped, his title suspended. For months he lived in near isolation. No letters, no music, no books. His world, once filled with ideas and the hope of enlightenment, was reduced to the echo of footsteps in a cold stone cell. The royal court whispered that he would be executed. Diplomats from neighbouring courts sent cautious inquiries, but the soldier king remained unmoved. He was determined to make an example of his son, to prove that even a crown prince was not above obedience. Hans Hermann von Katter, captured soon after, shared his friend's fate, though with less protection from birth. The court-martial was swift and merciless. Found guilty of assisting in the prince's escape, Katter was sentenced to death. The king, despite appeals for mercy, refused to intervene. His reasoning was brutal but consistent. Discipline must be absolute, even at the cost of personal anguish. Frederick, still confined at Kustrin, was informed that he would be forced to witness the execution. On a grey November morning, under a sky heavy with rain, Frederick was brought to the fortress window overlooking the courtyard. Below, soldiers assembled in solemn ranks. Katter, calm and dignified, was led forth to the scaffold. He looked up once, seeking the window where his friend stood. Accounts tell that he called out softly, "Farewell, my prince." Frederick, restrained by guards, cried out in agony, pleading for forgiveness. His composure shattered. Moments later, the sword fell. The sound echoed through the stone corridors and into the silence of Frederick's confinement. It was the last act of his youth, the death of his closest friend, and the final severing of the world he had tried to preserve. The months that followed were marked by despair and introspection. Frederick withdrew into himself, his earlier defiance replaced by a grave stillness. He studied theology and statecraft under supervision, read the works of classical historians, and began to reflect on the nature of power and obedience. The trauma of Katter's death did not break him, it reshaped him. He came to understand that rebellion without control led only to ruin, that authority, no matter how unjust, could not be opposed by emotion alone. His intellect, once impulsive and romantic, became disciplined and analytical. The flute was replaced by the study of war. The dream of escape gave way to the determination to endure. In time, Frederick William's rage subsided into a cold, conditional forgiveness. The king saw that his son, though subdued, had emerged stronger, more restrained. He ordered Frederick to serve once more in the army, but under close observation. The Crown Prince accepted without protest. To those who knew him, the change was unmistakable. His manners became measured, his tone deliberate, his smile rare. The boy, who had once sought beauty in defiance, now sought mastery in silence. Beneath that composure, however, a deeper transformation was taking place. He no longer saw authority as an external force to be resisted, but as a structure to be understood, wielded and, when necessary, reformed. The bond with his father never recovered fully, but a fragile truce was established. The soldier king, though unable to express affection, began to recognize the strength he had unintentionally forged. He had sought to make his son obedient. Instead, he had made him resilient. Frederick learned from pain what his father could never teach through love, that power requires self-control and that freedom must coexist with responsibility. In later years, when he ruled Prussia and commanded armies across Europe, he would remember Kustrin, not with bitterness, but with a detached clarity. It was there, in solitude and loss, that the foundations of his character were laid. The execution of Hans Hermann von Katter left an enduring shadow over Frederick's life. He spoke rarely of it, but those who served him in later years noticed that he treated acts of loyalty with unusual gravity. Betrayal, whether personal or political, would become to him the gravest of offences. In his private writings, he described friendship as a sacred trust, as precious as reason itself. Yet, perhaps unconsciously, he never again allowed affection to overrule judgment. Emotion, he had learned, was a weakness that power could not afford. By the time Frederick emerged from imprisonment, the Europe he would one day inherit was already changing. The old balance of kingdoms and alliances was shifting. Austria watched Prussia's growing strength with unease, and France, under the influence of the Enlightenment, began to question the old order. In this evolving world, the young prince who had once longed for escape was being shaped into a ruler who would one day command nations. The tragedy of Kustrin had forged in him not despair, but purpose. He had glimpsed, in the harshest way possible, the weight of destiny. The boy who had tried to flee Prussia would return to it not as a fugitive, but as its future king, and as a man who would never again surrender to fear. Frederick's confinement at Kustrin marked a turning point between youthful defiance and the cold maturity of responsibility. Once the heir to a throne, he was now a prisoner in a fortress less than 50 miles from his birthplace, yet worlds away from the freedom he had once imagined. The stone walls of Kustrin were not merely physical boundaries. They became symbols of obedience, silence, and reflection. The prince, deprived of books, music, and correspondence, was left with only his thoughts and the endless echo of military drills beyond the courtyard. Guards changed with mechanical precision, officers saluted with ritual exactness, and every action reminded him of the discipline that defined the Prussian state. It was within this severe stillness that Frederick began to transform, not through rebellion, but through endurance. At first, despair was his only companion. The loss of Hans Hermann von Katter, executed before his eyes, had cut deeply into his spirit. The guilt of survival haunted him. He had loved a world of reason and beauty, but that world had crumbled under the reality of power. There, within those walls, he learned that emotion, no matter how sincere, could not oppose the machinery of authority. He ceased to dream of escape and began instead to study the structure of power itself, how it was maintained, how it disciplined, how it endured. The young man who had once fled from tyranny now sought to understand it, not to imitate it, but to master it. His daily life at Kustrin followed a pattern designed to break pride and rebuild obedience. He was forced to attend endless military parades, observe court proceedings, and study state administration under officers who reported directly to his father. Letters of apology were required, confessions of loyalty drafted and redrafted. Each act of submission was observed, each hesitation noted. Yet over time, Frederick began to perform his duties with quiet precision. What had begun as punishment became a kind of education. He absorbed the details of administration, how taxes were collected, how grain was stored, how soldiers were recruited and trained. He came to understand that the state was not a symbol, but a living organism sustained by constant attention and order. This knowledge, gained under duress, would one day serve him as king far more than any lesson of philosophy. Gradually, his father's anger cooled, replaced by a cautious curiosity. The reports from Kustrin spoke of a prince who had changed, no longer defiant, no longer absorbed in art or argument, but diligent, composed, and obedient. Frederick William, though suspicious, allowed limited freedoms. The prince was permitted to write again, though his letters were read before they left the fortress. In them, Frederick's tone had shifted. His words were respectful, measured, and devoid of emotion. Yet between the lines, one could sense a new depth of restraint, the discipline not of submission, but of control. He had begun to master the art of appearing compliant while preserving his independence of thought. After a year, the king agreed to restore him partially to favour. Frederick was transferred to the nearby town of Ruppin, where he was given command of a small regiment. It was a test, not a reward, a way to observe whether obedience had truly taken root. The young prince accepted the assignment without protest. He drilled his soldiers with rigour, attended every inspection, and maintained the same austerity that his father demanded. His superiors reported that he rose before dawn, reviewed formations personally, and spoke little. Outwardly, he had become the model of a Prussian officer. Inwardly, however, he had begun to plan his future, not as a fugitive or dreamer, but as a strategist. In Ruppin, Frederick's intellectual life quietly revived. Freed from strict confinement, but still watched, he returned cautiously to reading. He studied the histories of Caesar, Tacitus, and the campaigns of modern commanders such as Marlborough and Turenne. But alongside these, he resumed correspondence with thinkers from France, concealing his philosophical interests under the guise of linguistic practice. His letters reveal a mind that had grown more analytical, less idealistic, and more conscious of the balance between intellect and authority. The flute returned to his hands, not as rebellion, but as a form of discipline, a daily exercise of precision and self-control. He had learned to combine art with order, reflection with restraint. It was the beginning of the balance that would define his reign. The reconciliation between father and son did not come easily. The soldier king remained harsh, but he began to see in Frederick a reflection of himself, though shaped by different means. When he visited Ruppin, he found his son transformed, a man who spoke respectfully, drilled his troops efficiently, and no longer questioned orders. The king's temper softened slightly, though his pride forbade open affection. Frederick, for his part, learned to navigate his father's moods with calm precision. He no longer opposed him, he endured him, and by enduring, he outlasted him. In the quiet town, away from the intrigues of Berlin, Frederick's reputation slowly began to recover. Officers who had once pitied or distrusted him began to respect his diligence. The soldiers admired his fairness and attention to their welfare. He inspected barracks personally, ensured rations were distributed properly, and avoided the extravagance that his father despised. This practical leadership earned him the loyalty of men who would one day follow him through some of the most demanding campaigns in European history. During these years, he also began to write again, brief essays on governance, morality, and the art of war. They were reflective rather than revolutionary, focused on the responsibilities of command and the ethical dimensions of authority. The rebellious tone of his youth had vanished, replaced by the cool logic of experience. He no longer sought to escape the structure of power, but to refine it, to make it serve not fear, but reason. The lessons of Kustrin had turned the idealist into a realist, the dreamer into a student of necessity. The relationship with his mother, Queen Sophia Dorothea, remained a source of quiet support. Though still restricted in her influence, she corresponded with her son through trusted intermediaries, offering comfort and hope. She reminded him that patience too was a form of strength, and that time often accomplished what defiance could not. These words, simple yet profound, stayed with Frederick. They taught him that endurance was not submission, but strategy, the art of waiting for the right moment to act. By the mid-1730s, the shadow of his imprisonment began to fade. Frederick was permitted to visit Berlin occasionally, to attend official functions, and even to dine at the royal table. The old tension remained, but the king's violent temper was less frequent. He had tested his son through humiliation, isolation, and loss, and found that the result was neither weakness nor rebellion, but strength tempered by intellect. What he did not yet realize was that this very transformation would one day create a ruler far greater than himself, a king who would govern through the same discipline he had once resisted, but with a vision that looked beyond obedience to the purpose of power itself. The prince, once a captive, had emerged from his confinement not broken, but defined. The years at Kustrin and Ruppin had given him what no royal education could, an intimate understanding of the machinery of the state and the psychology of command. He had lived under tyranny and therefore knew how it felt. He had suffered under fear and therefore learned to master it. The transformation was quiet, without ceremony or proclamation, but it marked the birth of the future Frederick the Great. In the stillness of the Prussian plains, among regiments and reports, a monarch was being shaped, one who would soon take the throne not as a dreamer, but as a strategist of nations. When the year 1740 dawned over Berlin, a still and sombre mood seemed to hang over the Prussian court. The long reign of Frederick William Maria was nearing its end, and the kingdom he had built, disciplined, frugal, and fiercely obedient, was about to pass into the hands of the son he had once imprisoned. The soldier king, now aged and frail, still ruled with the same iron will that had defined his life. But illness had reduced his strength and tempered his fury. His days were spent between prayer and pain, his temper softened by the inevitability of decline. He had forged his country into a military machine, and his son, who had once resisted him, now stood ready to inherit that machine, not as its servant, but as its master. Frederick had waited many years for this moment, yet when it came, it brought no joy. He had learned that power did not arrive as liberation, but as burden. The discipline of his youth, the coldness of his father's lessons, the loss of his friend, all had taught him that authority carried not glory, but responsibility. The court, sensing the change, watched in silence as the transition unfolded. Officers who had once served the old king with fear now turned their cautious respect toward the prince who would soon become their sovereign. The people, disciplined and industrious, expected continuity rather than reform. To them, the crown was less a symbol of majesty than of stability, a guarantee that Prussia's hard-won order would endure. On the morning of May 31st, 1740, Frederick William III died. The event passed without spectacle, as he would have wished. The funeral procession was austere, the ceremony brief. Frederick, now 28 years old, stood by his father's coffin in silence. Witnesses later recalled that his expression revealed no visible grief, only deep composure. But within, he must have felt the weight of an entire nation descending upon his shoulders. The son who had once trembled under command was now the commander of all. The father who had denied him freedom had, through suffering, given him strength. And now, in the quiet aftermath of death, Frederick inherited both the kingdom and the legacy of fear that came with it. When he ascended the throne, his first act surprised the court. He did not begin with parades or punishments, but with gestures of mercy and reform. Political prisoners were released, censorship was relaxed, and the use of torture in judicial proceedings was curtailed. Taxes on certain provinces were reduced, and letters of clemency were issued to officers who had fallen from favour under the old regime. Frederick declared that his reign would be guided by reason and humanity, not by cruelty. "I have no need to make men fear me," he wrote in his early decrees, "when I can make them respect me." It was a statement both philosophical and pragmatic, born from the contrast between the world he had inherited and the one he intended to build. Prussia at that time was a modest kingdom, small compared to France or Austria, yet formidable in its efficiency. Its army was disciplined, its administration meticulous, and its treasury well guarded. But it lacked prestige. It was not yet a great power. It was a tool of survival in the hands of a cautious ruler. Frederick saw in it the potential for greatness, not through expansion alone, but through the cultivation of intellect, culture, and reform. He opened his court to philosophers, invited artists and scholars, and filled his correspondence with men of learning. Voltaire, the great thinker he had admired since youth, became his correspondent and later his guest. To Frederick, the Enlightenment was not a distant movement. It was a personal creed. He believed that reason could guide not only thought, but governance itself. Yet even as he wrote of peace, the young king's mind was already turning toward war. The death of Emperor Charles VI of Austria that same year had thrown the European order into uncertainty. The emperor's daughter, Maria Theresa, had inherited the Habsburg dominions, but her claim was contested by rivals eager to exploit the weakness of succession. Among them stood the King of Prussia, newly crowned, ambitious, and watchful. To the surprise of Europe, Frederick saw in this moment not chaos, but opportunity. The province of Silesia, rich in industry and positioned between Prussia and Austria, had long been a point of contention. It was a land of strategic importance, fertile, prosperous, and vulnerable. Frederick believed it rightfully belonged to Prussia, both by claim and by destiny. The decision to seize it would transform him from philosopher into general, and from ruler into conqueror. Before he acted, he studied. He reviewed maps, examined reports, and consulted his generals in private. The army his father had built was among the finest in Europe, small but trained with unmatched discipline. Frederick understood its potential as few did. He had watched the drills since childhood, studied the tactics of past wars, and absorbed the principles of speed, precision, and surprise. Yet, unlike his father, he saw war not as an act of vengeance or divine duty, but as a calculated instrument of policy. To him, strategy was not merely movement on the battlefield, but the extension of intellect into force. He resolved to strike swiftly and decisively before his enemies could unite. In December 1740, only 6 months after his father's death, Frederick led his army across the frontier into Silesia. The campaign began quietly, almost without announcement. Snow covered the fields, and the roads were heavy with frost. The soldiers moved in disciplined silence, their blue coats blending into the pale landscape. Villages fell without resistance, fortresses surrendered, and within weeks the Prussian flag flew over much of the province. Europe looked on in astonishment. The philosopher king, who had spoken of justice and reason, had become a conqueror almost overnight. Yet Frederick saw no contradiction in this transformation. To him, conquest was not greed, but necessity. He believed that a strong state required secure borders and that greatness demanded initiative. His letters from the field reflect this duality: calm, analytical, yet alive with the thrill of command. "A king," he wrote, "must act. To hesitate is to lose the advantage of time, and time is the ally of those who dare." In that single sentence lay the essence of his reign: intellect united with action, philosophy tempered by resolve. As the year drew to a close, the war that would define his legacy had begun. The armies of Austria prepared to resist. Alliances formed in haste, and the balance of Europe trembled once again. But in the midst of this turmoil, Frederick stood firm, young, confident, and utterly certain of his purpose. The crown he had inherited through suffering was no longer a burden, but a weapon, and the discipline his father had forced upon him now became his greatest strength. The boy, who had once dreamed of escape, had become the man who would reshape his world through will and reason. The age of Frederick had begun, not with celebration, but with the measured sound of drums echoing across the snow-covered plains of Silesia. The invasion of Silesia marked the moment when Frederick ceased to be merely a philosopher upon a throne and became a commander in the field. The transition was swift, but not impulsive. Every movement of his army, every dispatch he sent to Berlin, revealed a mind that treated war as an exact science, a domain where precision replaced emotion and calculation replaced chance. The snows of December 1740 had scarcely melted when the campaign began in earnest. The Prussian army, drilled to near perfection under his father's relentless system, advanced through the province in ordered ranks. Their uniforms were plain, their movements synchronized, their silence unnerving. To the peasants and townspeople who watched from doorways, they were not a band of soldiers, but a mechanism, an expression of the new Prussian state in motion. Frederick's early successes were the product not of overwhelming force, but of speed and intelligence. He struck before Austria could organize its defense, exploiting confusion in Vienna following the death of Emperor Charles VI. His troops captured city after city with minimal resistance, establishing control over key fortresses and communication lines. Yet beneath this calm efficiency, Frederick's nerves were tested. For all his study of military theory, he had never before commanded in battle. Each decision carried the weight of his kingdom's future. The crown he wore was still new, its legitimacy untested. Failure in Silesia would have meant not only territorial loss, but the end of Prussia's ambitions before they had begun. In April 1741, his trial came at Mollwitz. It was his first major battle, and one that nearly ended his reign before it had truly begun. The Austrian army, commanded by the experienced Field Marshal Neperg, outnumbered and outmanoeuvred the Prussians in the early hours. The snow was thick on the ground, the fields wet with thaw. Frederick, nervous and uncertain, placed too much faith in textbook manoeuvres. When the Austrian cavalry broke through the Prussian right flank, confusion spread among his troops. The young king, believing the battle lost, withdrew from the field to avoid capture, leaving command to his generals. Yet what might have been disaster became triumph through the discipline his father had instilled. General Schwerin rallied the infantry, whose relentless volleys of musket fire, executed with mechanical precision, repelled the Austrian charge and turned the tide. When the smoke cleared, the field belonged to Prussia. Mollwitz had been won, though not by Frederick's hand. In Berlin, the news of victory spread rapidly, and with it the legend of the young king. Pamphlets praised his courage and strategy, though he privately knew how narrowly fortune had favoured him. To his officers, he admitted his error without shame. "One learns by experience," he said simply. "I am determined to profit from mine." From that moment, Frederick resolved never again to allow theory to overrule instinct, nor to flee from danger. He began to ride with his troops, to study terrain first-hand, to calculate not only movements, but morale. The transformation from scholar to strategist was underway. The following month saw the consolidation of Silesia under Prussian control. Frederick established administration swiftly, ensuring that taxes, law, and discipline followed the army's advance. To the conquered population, he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a ruler of order and efficiency. He demanded obedience, but promised fairness, and by doing so, he began to win grudging respect. Meanwhile, the great powers of Europe took notice. France, seeing an opportunity to weaken Austria, offered its support. Russia, distracted by internal issues, remained distant. The intricate web of alliances that would later define the 7 Years' War began here, in the aftermath of Silesia. Frederick's correspondence from this period reveals both ambition and anxiety. In his letters to Voltaire, he described the campaign with a mixture of pride and irony, often calling himself the philosopher turned brigand. Yet behind the humour lay a clear sense of purpose. He believed that Silesia was not merely a prize, but the foundation upon which Prussia's future greatness would rest. To govern effectively, the kingdom needed resources, population, and prestige, and Silesia provided all three. Still, he was aware of the precariousness of his position. Austria, though stunned, was far from defeated, and Maria Theresa, young and determined, refused to surrender her inheritance. The year 1742 brought renewed fighting, and with it, the maturing of Frederick's command. At Chotusitz, he demonstrated the composure and decisiveness that would later define his legend. The battle unfolded under a blazing sun on the plains of Bohemia. Both armies manoeuvred cautiously at first, but when the Austrian flank exposed itself, Frederick acted with speed. His infantry advanced in tight formation, their volleys timed with mathematical precision. The enemy line wavered, then broke. The victory was complete, and this time there was no doubt as to who commanded it. Frederick had earned not only his soldiers' obedience, but their confidence. He was no longer the philosopher king uncertain in battle. He was the general who led from the front, cool and exact, even amid chaos. The Peace of Breslau, signed soon after, secured Silesia for Prussia and brought the First Silesian War to a close. The treaty was as much a triumph of diplomacy as of arms. Frederick's success elevated Prussia to a position of influence that astonished Europe. The small northern kingdom, once dismissed as a provincial military state, now stood beside the great powers as an equal. In Vienna, Maria Theresa seethed but bided her time. In Paris, ministers spoke admiringly of the new Prussian king. In London, he was regarded with cautious respect. Even his own subjects, who had once viewed him with uncertainty, began to see him as the embodiment of a new kind of monarch, rational, decisive, and unflinching. For Frederick, the victory carried deeper meaning. It was proof that intellect could command the field as surely as courage. The lessons of his father, once despised, had become tools of mastery. Yet he did not celebrate extravagantly. His letters from this period are restrained, his tone analytical. "I have gained a province," he wrote, "but I have learned that war is not the path to peace. It is only the instrument by which one may secure it." Such reflections hinted at the dual nature of his rule, the man of thought who embraced war as necessity, and the soldier who understood the value of reason above conquest. In Berlin, he returned to a city transformed by triumph, yet still austere by habit. There were no grand parades, no golden processions. Frederick's victory was marked by silence, efficiency, and renewal. He reorganized his administration, improved the legal system, and encouraged agriculture in the newly acquired lands. The philosopher in him sought order where the general had made chaos. He spent long hours in council, dictating reforms, reading reports, and composing essays on governance. To his ministers, he appeared tireless, to his people, distant, but just. The First Silesian War had done more than expand Prussia's territory. It had revealed the balance of Frederick's character. The boy who once trembled under the weight of authority had become the embodiment of it. His victories were not acts of passion, but of logic. His ambition not reckless, but measured. Yet within that precision lay a quiet warning. Power, once tasted, demanded more. The conquest of Silesia had been an experiment in destiny, and destiny, once awakened, does not rest. The Peace of Breslau brought calm to Europe, but in Frederick's mind it was only an interval, a pause between movements in a symphony whose final resolution was yet to come. When the guns of the First Silesian War fell silent, Frederick returned to his capital not as the uncertain prince who had once trembled before his father, but as the architect of a new power. Prussia, once a small and rigid state on the northern plain, now stood among the great kingdoms of Europe. Its army was respected, its treasury full, its borders extended. Yet the victory that brought Frederick glory also introduced him to a more intricate kind of warfare, one waged not on fields of battle, but across tables of negotiation, through dispatches, alliances, and letters sealed in wax. The battlefield had tested his nerve. Diplomacy would test his intellect. The Treaty of Breslau, signed in 1742, confirmed Prussia's possession of Silesia and temporarily ended hostilities with Austria. The war had been brief, sharp, and decisive. Yet Frederick understood that peace was not a state of rest, but a condition to be managed. Europe remained restless. Maria Theresa, the young Queen of Austria, though outwardly resigned, was already planning to reclaim what she had lost. France and Britain, long rivals, eyed each other warily across the continent. Their ambitions intertwined with the shifting alliances of smaller states. To survive, Prussia needed more than soldiers. It needed diplomacy guided by intellect and restraint. Frederick had no illusions about the nature of European politics. He once remarked to a minister that treaties were like flowers in winter, beautiful but fragile, likely to wither at the first thaw. Still, he approached diplomacy with the same precision that he brought to military science. He read every report personally, analysed every letter from foreign courts, and wrote much of his own correspondence in a firm, measured hand. His dispatches were models of clarity, polite but exact, calm but firm. To his allies he was courteous, to his rivals inscrutable. He never revealed more than necessary and preferred persuasion to threat. It was not charm that guided his diplomacy, but logic. During these years, he cultivated a relationship with France, whose ministers saw in him both a useful ally and a man of their own intellectual world. Voltaire, his longtime correspondent, acted at times as an intermediary, praising Frederick's rational governance to the French court and presenting him as the embodiment of the Enlightenment ideal, a philosopher on the throne. Yet Frederick's pragmatism ran deeper than philosophy. He sought alliances not out of sentiment or ideology, but from necessity. His letters to French officials reveal a mind always weighing advantage and risk. When he praised friendship, it was with the understanding that friendship too could serve the state. At home, Frederick devoted himself to governance with the same intensity that he had once given to campaign planning. He reorganized the administration of Silesia, ensuring that its revenues were efficiently collected and its laws harmonized with Prussian order. Roads were built, trade encouraged, and the population treated with fairness that contrasted sharply with Austrian rule. He insisted that officials act with integrity and that justice be swift and impartial. His motto, "The king is the first servant of the state," was more than rhetoric. It was the guiding principle of his reign. He worked long hours, rarely resting, reading reports until late in the night, and writing notes in the margins with his characteristic precision. Those who served under him learned that excuses were not tolerated, and inefficiency was treated as disloyalty. Yet Frederick's idea of governance extended beyond efficiency. He believed that a ruler should also cultivate the intellect of his nation. He encouraged education, supported writers and musicians, and founded academies of science. Berlin, once austere and provincial, began to take on the atmosphere of a capital where thought and order coexisted. Philosophers debated under his patronage, and artists found protection under his name. But even in these acts of cultural generosity, there was calculation. Frederick understood that prestige was as valuable as territory, that the respect of Europe depended not only on the strength of his army, but also on the brilliance of his mind. Despite his outward calm, Frederick's correspondence from this period reveals a man never entirely at ease. Beneath the measured tone of his letters, there is a constant awareness of danger. He knew that Maria Theresa's resentment had not cooled, and that Austria, though defeated, was gathering strength. He suspected that his alliance with France, built upon convenience, could dissolve at any moment. His understanding of diplomacy was almost mathematical. Alliances were variables in an ever-changing equation, each one valuable only as long as it served equilibrium. He admired the writings of Machiavelli, not for cynicism, but for clarity. In politics, he once wrote, one must see not what is desired, but what is possible. It was during these quieter years that Frederick and Voltaire finally met in person. The philosopher, long the voice of French reason, accepted Frederick's invitation to Potsdam in 1743. Their meeting was a union of wit and intellect, two sharp minds mirroring each other across the candlelit salons of Sanssouci. They debated philosophy, poetry, and the art of rule. Voltaire admired Frederick's lucidity and the calm authority with which he spoke. Frederick admired Voltaire's intellect, though he found in him flashes of vanity. For a time, they enjoyed mutual fascination, the king and the philosopher, each seeing in the other the image of what he might have been in different circumstances. Yet, as with all strong minds, harmony could not last. Frederick's discipline clashed with Voltaire's freedom, and though their friendship endured in letters, it would never again be simple. On the international stage, the balance of power continued to shift. Austria sought allies in Britain and Russia, while France encouraged Prussia to act more boldly. Frederick, wary of entanglement, preferred caution. He consolidated his gains, strengthened the army, and refined the state's finances. Under his direction, the army became not only larger but more flexible, its organisation reflecting his growing understanding of strategy. He reformed recruitment, improved logistics, and insisted that officers be educated as well as trained. For him, war was no longer an act of impulse. It was a system, a science of movement and timing governed by intellect. By 1744, however, diplomacy had reached its limits. The Austrian court, determined to recover Silesia, began forming alliances that threatened Prussia's position. Frederick, who had hoped to secure peace through negotiation, now saw that the next test would again be on the battlefield. Yet this time, he approached war not as an inexperienced ruler seeking recognition, but as a seasoned strategist defending his achievements. The philosopher had become a statesman. The statesman was preparing once more to become a soldier. And so, even as the salons of Sanssouci filled with the sound of music and learned conversation, the forges of Brandenburg clanged with the making of muskets, and regiments drilled in silent precision on the frozen fields. The balance between reason and force that defined Frederick's life began to tilt once more toward action. The pen had secured his first peace. The sword would soon be called upon to defend it. In this calm before the storm, Frederick of Prussia, philosopher, ruler, and tactician, stood ready to test again the unity of intellect and power that would make his name echo through the centuries. The peace that followed Frederick's first victory proved short-lived, as all great ambitions are often haunted by unfinished designs. Barely 2 years after the ink dried on the Treaty of Breslau, the air of Europe was once again tense with suspicion. Maria Theresa, unbroken in spirit and newly secure upon her throne, had begun to rebuild Austria's strength with remarkable resolve. Her ministers worked tirelessly to restore alliances. Her generals rearmed the army, and her diplomats courted the support of Britain and Russia. Frederick, observing all of this from Potsdam, understood that his conquest of Silesia had not closed a chapter, but opened a new one that would decide whether Prussia's rise was a temporary accident or the beginning of a new order in Europe. By 1744, the fragile peace unravelled. France, seeking to weaken Austria through renewed conflict, invited Frederick to rejoin its alliance and strike again. The temptation was great. Though Prussia's position was secure for the moment, the king feared that inaction might allow his enemies to grow too strong. His reasoning was cold but clear. In politics, he wrote, one must anticipate danger rather than await it. In August of that year, Prussian forces crossed into Bohemia. The campaign began with the same efficiency that had marked his earlier success. Prague fell without prolonged resistance, and once again Europe witnessed the precision of the Prussian army, its movements calculated as if by compass, its morale unshaken, its discipline absolute. Yet the war that followed proved less certain and far more costly. The Austrians, hardened by defeat, fought with new determination. Their forces avoided open battle, harassing the Prussians through attrition, cutting supply lines, and exploiting the difficult terrain. Frederick, accustomed to rapid victories, found himself entangled in a campaign that drained his resources and tested his endurance. The autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud, provisions ran short, and disease began to thin the ranks. The king, usually composed, grew restless and impatient. His letters from this period are filled with terse remarks and weary reflections. War, he wrote to one of his ministers, is a trade where one gains by misfortune as often as by design. As winter approached, the tide turned against him. Forced to withdraw from Bohemia, Frederick conducted one of the most disciplined retreats in military history. His soldiers, though exhausted, obeyed every order without hesitation. Columns moved in silence, artillery rolled through the snow, and the rearguard repelled constant attacks with mechanical precision. It was during this retreat that Frederick's leadership truly came into full view, not in triumph, but in composure under adversity. He did not speak of glory, he spoke of endurance, of the need to outlast rather than overpower. The experience hardened him. He began to understand that mastery in war lay not only in daring attacks, but in the strength to withdraw without disarray. The following year, in 1745, the conflict reignited with greater force. Austria, now allied with Saxony, advanced into Silesia. Frederick, facing a coalition that outnumbered him, responded with speed that astonished his enemies. Within weeks, he assembled his army and struck at the heart of the Allied forces near Hohenfriedberg. The battle that ensued on June 4, 1745, would become one of the defining moments of his military career. At dawn, under a pale mist, the Prussian infantry advanced in disciplined waves, their drums steady, their movements exact. The enemy line, confident and numerous, began to falter under the relentless volleys. At the decisive moment, Frederick ordered a cavalry charge led by the famed Bayreuth dragoons. The attack, executed with precision and fury, shattered the Austrian flank. By midday, the battle was over. Thousands of enemy troops lay upon the field. The Prussian banners stood unshaken. Hohenfriedberg was more than a victory. It was the vindication of Frederick's method, his insistence on training, his attention to detail, and his belief in mobility and initiative had transformed the Prussian army into an instrument of unmatched efficiency. Soldiers who had once viewed him as a scholar on horseback now followed him with absolute faith. Even his critics, both at home and abroad, recognized that he had elevated warfare to an art of intellect and timing. The young king who had once fled the field at Mollwitz now commanded with the composure of a veteran. Yet Frederick did not exult. His reports to Berlin were factual, restrained, even cold. He understood that triumph was fleeting and that each victory carried within it the seed of future conflict. The campaign did not end there. In September of the same year, he struck again at Soor, in the hills of Bohemia. Outnumbered and caught in difficult terrain, he once more relied on swift manoeuvre and disciplined aggression. The Prussian infantry, advancing uphill under heavy fire, maintained formation with remarkable steadiness. The Austrian forces, unable to hold their ground, were forced into retreat. The victory was costly but decisive, and it marked the close of the Second Silesian War. The Treaty of Dresden, signed in December 1745, confirmed Prussia's possession of Silesia once more and secured a peace that, for the moment, seemed to assure Frederick's dominance. In the eyes of Europe, Frederick had become the model of a modern ruler, intelligent, fearless, and methodical. To some he was a philosopher in uniform, to others a conqueror cloaked in reason. Even his enemies, though they despised his ambition, could not deny his genius. In Vienna, Maria Theresa, though forced again to concede Silesia, spoke of him with grudging respect. In Paris, he was hailed as a hero of the Enlightenment, proof that intellect could master the art of war. Yet within Frederick himself, there was no sense of finality. He saw peace not as the end of struggle, but as its continuation by subtler means. One governs, he wrote to a confidant, as one fights, by vigilance and precision. Victory is never complete. It must be maintained every day. The war had changed him. He returned to Potsdam thinner, quieter, and more deliberate. The once restless energy of youth had been replaced by the measured patience of command. He devoted himself to rebuilding what war had consumed, reorganizing the army, replenishing the treasury, and restoring the rhythm of state. But even amid the calm, his thoughts remained restless. He had seen too much to believe in lasting peace. Europe, with its fragile treaties and jealous ambitions, was a balance forever in motion. He knew that sooner or later the forces he had outmaneuvered would rise again. As winter settled over Berlin, Frederick withdrew more frequently to his study, surrounded by books and maps. The flute returned to his hand, the music now slower, more reflective, touched by the memory of battle. Visitors noticed in him a new gravity, a composure born of both triumph and fatigue. He had conquered Silesia twice, but at a cost that only he could fully measure. The soldier had proven his mastery. The statesman was now called upon to sustain it. For a time, Europe would rest, but only for a time. In the stillness of his palace at Sanssouci, Frederick of Prussia began to turn his thoughts toward the next challenge, sensing that destiny, like war, seldom allows long intervals of peace. After years of conflict, Frederick's gaze turned inward, to his realm, to his mind, and to the quiet that follows victory. In the spring of 1747, construction began on a modest retreat atop the terraced vineyards of Potsdam, a place that would become both sanctuary and symbol. He named it Sanssouci, without care. The name was a reflection not of idleness, but of aspiration. Frederick had fought his wars and secured his crown, but he sought now to rule through intellect, to govern by reason, and to find, if not peace in Europe, at least peace within himself. Sanssouci was not conceived as a palace of grandeur. It was built in the manner of a villa, low, elegant, adorned with columns and vines, open to the landscape rather than dominating it. Frederick supervised its design personally, dictating details of proportion, light, and symmetry. The architecture reflected his nature, rational, measured, austere in ornament, yet rich in harmony. To those who visited, it seemed less a royal residence than a retreat for thought. Here the king received philosophers, poets, and scientists. Here he read, wrote, and played music far into the night. The rhythm of statecraft gave way, for brief hours, to the rhythm of reflection. Voltaire arrived at Sanssouci in 1750, fulfilling a friendship long cultivated through letters. The meeting of the philosopher and the monarch fascinated all Europe. They dined together, debated endlessly, and read aloud passages of classical verse. Frederick admired Voltaire's wit and brilliance, though he often smiled at his vanity. Voltaire admired Frederick's discipline, though he found his precision at times oppressive. Their exchanges were sharp but cordial, the talk flowing between politics, philosophy, and the question that haunted their age, whether reason could truly guide power. To the courtiers, these conversations seemed the summit of enlightenment, the fusion of intellect and authority, the dream of a just and rational monarch made real. Yet beneath the civility, subtle differences grew. Frederick's reason was pragmatic, bound to the necessity of rule. Voltaire's was ideal, devoted to the freedom of thought. The tension between them mirrored the tension of the century itself. In those years, Prussia prospered. The administration functioned with precision. The army remained disciplined, and trade expanded across the borders Frederick had secured. He reformed the judiciary, reducing corruption and simplifying procedure. He encouraged immigration, inviting artisans and farmers to repopulate lands devastated by war. Taxes were adjusted with fairness, education strengthened, and agriculture modernized. To his ministers, he was demanding but just. He wrote personally to his provincial governors, admonishing negligence and rewarding efficiency. A state, he once wrote, must be like a clock, each wheel turning in harmony with the next. Under his direction, the Prussian clock began to run with remarkable regularity. But order was not enough. Frederick's mind sought refinement as much as control. At Sanssouci, he gathered musicians, painters, and thinkers, creating a court unlike any in Europe, neither frivolous nor servile, but intellectual. The evenings were filled with discussion, music, and readings from the classics. He composed for the flute, not as pastime, but as discipline, treating music as an extension of logic. Each note, he said, must follow by reason from the one before. His style in both art and governance was the same, precise, deliberate, unsentimental. Even his letters to Voltaire, filled with wit, carried the tone of a man for whom reason was not a philosophy, but a habit of mind. Yet amid this calm, a shadow lingered. The victories of the Silesian Wars had elevated Prussia, but they had also drawn envy. Austria, humiliated yet unbroken, continued to rebuild. Maria Theresa's ministers in Vienna, guided by the shrewd Count Kaunitz, began a subtle campaign of diplomacy aimed at isolating Frederick. The old alliances that had once protected him began to shift. France, distracted by its own ambitions, grew less reliable. Britain, wary of continental entanglements, looked elsewhere. The diplomatic fabric of Europe was being rewoven, and at its centre, unseen by the public, a great reversal was taking shape. Austria and France, traditional enemies for centuries, began to find common cause against the new Prussian power. Frederick was aware of these movements, but he regarded them with scepticism rather than alarm. His confidence in his own judgment was deep, perhaps too deep. "They will not risk another war so soon," he wrote in 1755. "The cost of defeat has taught them prudence." Yet his intelligence network, as efficient as it was, failed to grasp the full extent of the coming danger. The diplomatic revolution of 1756, an event that would reshape the entire balance of Europe, was already in motion. Prussia, once the ally of France, would soon stand alone against the might of Austria, Russia, and France combined. The philosopher-king of Sanssouci, whose days had been filled with the cadence of flutes and the quiet logic of correspondence, would soon find himself drawn back into the world of battle, forced once more to lead by the sword rather than the pen. Before the storm broke, however, Frederick experienced perhaps the most peaceful period of his life. Sanssouci was complete, its gardens flourishing, its salons alive with discourse. Visitors described the king as calm, approachable, even witty. He rose early, worked methodically, and in the evenings withdrew to music and conversation. He wrote treatises on politics and morality, many of which circulated privately among European thinkers. In one, he outlined his ideal of monarchy. The sovereign must be the first servant of the state. His happiness lies in the welfare of his people. He must govern not for glory, but for the good. These words, so simple and rational, reflected his lifelong effort to reconcile power with philosophy, to transform kingship from domination into duty. But ideals cannot shield a state from the forces of history. Beyond the walls of Sanssouci, armies were assembling, treaties were being signed in secrecy, and the great powers were preparing for a war that would engulf the continent. Frederick's faith in reason, though unshaken, would soon be tested against the chaos of ambition and revenge. The tranquility of Sanssouci, that brief interlude of intellect and art, would become a memory, a luminous pause before the longest and hardest trial of his reign. In the summer evenings of 1755, Frederick often walked the terraces of his estate, gazing toward the horizon where the sun set over the Prussian plains. He had built his life on control, yet the horizon remained beyond his reach. He could govern men, command armies, and write laws, but he could not govern the shifting temper of Europe. As the light faded, he must have sensed that peace, like all human achievements, was only temporary, a form of order that exists until history demands its renewal. Within a year, the sound of flutes would be drowned by the thunder of cannons, and the philosopher of Sanssouci would once again become the general of Prussia. The calm that rested over Europe in the mid-1750s was deceptive, a pause between tempests, fragile and filled with hidden movements. While Frederick walked the terraces of Sanssouci, confident in the balance of diplomacy he believed he had mastered, the old continent was quietly redrawing its allegiances. The so-called diplomatic revolution was unfolding, a slow, almost invisible transformation that would alter the course of European power. For centuries, France and Austria had been hereditary enemies, their rivalry defining the wars of previous generations. Yet under the patient manoeuvring of the Austrian minister, Count Kaunitz, a new alliance was forged between them, one united not by friendship, but by necessity. Their shared purpose was simple and direct: to contain and, if possible, destroy Prussia. Frederick sensed unease, but not the full magnitude of the threat. His correspondence abroad sent reports of shifting policies, of treaties whispered in Paris and Vienna, of envoys passing through Dresden with uncharacteristic secrecy. He dismissed much of it as rumour or diplomatic posturing. The king had learned from experience that Europe often lived in a state of tension without erupting into war. But in this case, his reasoning betrayed him. Maria Theresa, still nursing the humiliation of Silesia, had resolved to reclaim what she considered rightfully hers. Russia, fearing the rise of Prussia as a rival in the north, joined her cause. Sweden lent support, and France, persuaded by Kaunitz's vision, sealed the alliance. In a single year, the entire balance of Europe had turned against Frederick. The news reached him slowly, through coded messages and intercepted letters. But when its implications became clear, his response was instinctive. He would not wait to be surrounded. The army his father had built and he had perfected was the sharpest weapon in Europe, disciplined, mobile, and ready. He understood the principle of initiative. To strike first was to command the tempo of war. Delay would mean encirclement. Hesitation would mean destruction. The fate of Prussia, he told his generals in a private council, is not to be defended, but to be decided. In August 1756, without formal declaration, Frederick crossed the frontier into Saxony. The small electorate, neutral in name but leaning toward Austria, became his first target. His army moved with its usual precision, 60,000 men advancing in silent columns, their uniforms gleaming under the late summer sun. The invasion was swift, almost surgical. Within weeks, Saxon forces were surrounded near Pirna, their resistance overwhelmed. The world was shocked not by the scale of the action, but by its audacity. A war had begun, and once again Frederick was the aggressor. But this time, his opponents were not scattered or unprepared. They were united, vast, and determined. The justification Frederick gave to Europe was as calculated as his campaign. He declared that Saxony's neutrality was a pretense, that its alliance with Austria threatened Prussian security. Yet beyond the words lay a deeper logic. By seizing Saxony, he gained both territory and strategic depth, creating a defensive barrier between Prussia and the southern front. The decision was risky, but entirely in keeping with his philosophy of warfare: act swiftly, strike decisively, and never allow the enemy to dictate the field. He wrote to Voltaire that autumn, "It is better to prevent a disaster than to lament it." The philosopher, ever cautious, replied that reason should serve peace, not conquest. Frederick answered only, "Peace is preserved by vigilance. I act so that others may hesitate." By winter, the coalition had fully formed. Austria mobilized in the south, Russia in the east, and France prepared to strike from the west. Prussia stood alone, save for a loose alliance with Britain, whose interests were largely naval and distant. The contrast was immense: Frederick's disciplined 150,000 men against the combined forces of nearly 500,000 soldiers arrayed against him. Yet he was unshaken. He understood that victory would not depend on numbers, but on speed, coordination, and will. The war that began as a local conflict would soon engulf every major power in Europe and even spread across the oceans. The world would later call it the 7 Years' War, but for Frederick it was a struggle for survival, a test not only of his state, but of his entire philosophy of rule. The early campaigns revealed the sharpness of his strategic vision. From the captured cities of Saxony, he moved south toward Bohemia, seeking to strike Austria before its allies could converge. His army marched with astonishing endurance, crossing mountain passes and rivers with precision that astonished foreign observers. Every regiment, every battery of artillery moved as part of a larger design. Frederick was everywhere, riding ahead to scout positions, drafting orders by candlelight, and personally inspecting the placement of guns. His presence was both intellectual and physical. Soldiers who saw him at dawn, his cloak drawn tight against the cold, later recalled that he seemed less a man than the embodiment of discipline itself. In the spring of 1757, he reached the gates of Prague. The Austrian army, numbering nearly 80,000, waited within the city's defences. Frederick, outnumbered but confident, resolved to force battle. On May 6th, under a pale sky and rising dust, the Prussians attacked. The fighting was brutal and confused. Cannon smoke hung thick over the fields, and the roar of musketry was unbroken for hours. Frederick directed movements calmly, his staff surrounding him in disciplined silence. By afternoon, the Austrian lines had collapsed. The victory was total, but costly. More than 10,000 Prussians lay dead or wounded. The king, surveying the field that evening, was silent for a long time before saying only, "So much blood for such a small result." It was a rare admission of weariness from a man whose mind usually treated war as an equation. Yet fortune's balance never remained long in his favour. Within weeks his army suffered a severe defeat at Kolin, where Austrian forces under Field Marshal Daun struck with unexpected precision. Frederick's losses were heavy, his troops forced into retreat. For the first time since ascending the throne, his composure faltered. "I am undone," he wrote in a private note, "and I would that I were no more." It was not despair of the ordinary kind, but the shock of a mind accustomed to control facing the truth of limitation. Still, he rallied. He reorganized his army, reinforced discipline, and refused to concede. He told his generals that defeat was a teacher more exacting than any victory. As 1756 turned to 1757, Europe's attention fixed upon Prussia. The small kingdom had drawn upon itself the wrath of 3 empires and still stood defiant. Frederick's reputation shifted from admiration to awe. He was no longer merely a brilliant monarch. He had become a symbol of endurance. In London, the newspapers called him the modern Alexander. In Vienna, he was the monster of the North, but in his own mind he was neither hero nor villain. "I am," he wrote, "a player upon the board of Providence, moving where necessity commands." The 7 Years' War had begun, and its course would carry him to both the height of triumph and the edge of despair. The philosopher of Sanssouci was now a soldier once more, bound not to peace or art, but to the relentless rhythm of command. His flute lay silent, his books unread, while the map of Europe spread before him like a chessboard. Each day brought new reports, new movements, new calculations. The fate of his kingdom, the survival of his dynasty, and the measure of his own will, all would now be decided not by theory or argument, but by the discipline of men under fire. The thunder of artillery that echoed across the plains of Saxony in the spring of 1757 marked the opening of a struggle that would outlast its generals and reshape the balance of the known world. The 7 Years' War was unlike the limited campaigns of Frederick's youth. It was a conflict of empires, fought not only across the fields of Europe, but on distant seas and colonies. Britain and France clashed for mastery beyond the oceans, while on the continent, Frederick of Prussia stood isolated against the combined might of Austria, Russia, France, and Sweden. What began as an act of preemption had become a war for survival. After his early triumph at Prague, Frederick's confidence, though tempered by the cost, remained steady. He believed that disciplined strategy and swift initiative could overcome the weight of numbers. His army, hardened and exact in every motion, remained his instrument of control in a world descending into chaos. Yet the defeat at Kolin soon shattered that illusion of certainty. The loss forced him to withdraw from Bohemia, abandoning the conquests of the previous year. His letters from that summer show a rare glimpse of vulnerability. "Courage," he wrote, "is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The state has lost a battle, but not its resolve." The discipline that defined him as a ruler became his shield. He neither lamented nor hesitated. He prepared again for war. Europe watched closely as Prussia reeled under the pressure of multiple fronts. The Austrians advanced from the south, the Russians from the east, the Swedes threatened from the north, and the French crossed the Rhine to strike from the west. It was a noose tightening around a single nation. Yet Frederick refused to divide his strength in panic. His method was mobility. He moved where he was needed most, trusting his subordinates to hold the rest. He was seen riding through rain and snow, surveying terrain, planning maneuvers with mathematical clarity. To him, every battlefield was a problem to be solved, every delay a calculation of endurance. His genius lay in seeing patterns where others saw confusion. In November of that same year, the campaign reached one of its most dramatic moments. The French army under Marshal Soubise and their allies from the Holy Roman Empire gathered near the Saxon town of Rossbach, confident that at last the Prussian king would be crushed. Frederick, commanding fewer than 25,000 men against an enemy twice his size, chose not to retreat. On the morning of November 5th, 1757, under a grey and windy sky, he observed the enemy's slow and disordered movement across the plain. The French believed they were turning his flank, but Frederick had foreseen their plan. He ordered a swift, oblique manoeuvre, a sudden pivot of cavalry and artillery that struck the exposed side of the Allied column. The effect was instantaneous. Confusion rippled through the ranks. The disciplined volleys of Prussian fire broke the advance, and a single charge of cavalry scattered the enemy entirely. The battle was over in 90 minutes. Rossbach was more than a victory. It was a revelation. The armies of the greatest powers in Europe had been defeated by precision, not by force. Frederick's mastery of timing, the synchronization of infantry and cavalry, and his capacity to read the movement of the enemy in real time marked a new kind of warfare. The battle transformed his reputation overnight. In London, newspapers hailed him as the wonder of the age. In Paris, Voltaire wrote that the king had defeated ignorance with geometry. Yet Frederick himself remained restrained. His correspondence that evening was brief. "A victory," he wrote to his minister, "that restores balance to the board. We have taught them to respect discipline." Even before his soldiers could rest, Frederick turned eastward. News had arrived that another enemy force, an Austrian army, was advancing through Silesia, threatening the heart of his newly won province. Without pause, he marched across snow and ice to meet them. On December 5th, 1757, near the village of Leuthen, he faced an army nearly twice his size. The field was wide and open, the air sharp with winter frost. The Austrians, confident in their numbers, occupied a strong position. Frederick studied the terrain in silence, then devised a manoeuvre that would later become a model of tactical genius. He feigned attack on one flank, then swiftly shifted his entire force to the other, striking the Austrian line where it was weakest. The movement was executed with perfect coordination, the kind of precision that only years of unyielding drill could produce. As the sun fell, the Austrian army collapsed under the relentless advance of the Prussian infantry. Frederick, riding at the front, directed each phase of the attack with calm detachment. When the battle ended, the field was covered in silence and snow, the Prussian standard standing firm amid the ruins of the enemy's ranks. The victory at Leuthen, achieved against overwhelming odds, secured his place among the great captains of history. The king who had once fled from Mollwitz now stood beside Alexander and Caesar in the minds of his contemporaries. But even triumph carried a shadow. The losses were immense, and the strain upon the nation deepened. Prussia was small, its population limited, its treasury strained by years of war. Each victory, bought time, not peace. Frederick knew it. His letters grew darker, his reflections more measured. "We fight," he wrote, "not for conquest, but for existence. When all is finished, there will be little left to rule but the ashes of duty." His tone was neither bitter nor self-pitying, but factual, a recognition that the war had become a struggle of endurance, one that would test not only armies, but the will of nations. In Berlin, the people celebrated with cautious pride. The victories at Rossbach and Leuthen had saved the kingdom from collapse and silenced those who had doubted the young monarch's judgment. Yet even in triumph, Frederick remained apart. He refused grand ceremonies and declined portraits that glorified the campaign. He preferred the company of his soldiers, sharing their hardships, reviewing the wounded, and ensuring supplies for the coming winter. His sense of kingship was rooted not in display, but in service. He often said that a ruler who sought admiration would soon lose authority. As the year closed, Frederick stood at the height of his fame, yet also at the edge of exhaustion. The 7 Years' War had only begun, and its weight would soon grow heavier than any crown. The King of Prussia, who had once ruled by reason and reform, was now bound entirely to the rhythm of conflict. He had become, by necessity, what his father had long demanded, a soldier above all things. Yet unlike his father, Frederick's war was not waged for discipline alone, but for the survival of an idea, that intellect, when allied with will, could defy the sheer weight of the world. The snow continued to fall over Silesia that winter. In the barracks, soldiers spoke in hushed voices of their king, who rode with them through fire and frost, a figure neither distant nor divine, but human in endurance and purpose. In the silence that followed Leuthen, Europe paused in awe. It seemed, for a brief moment, that the tide of the century had turned, but Frederick knew better than to trust stillness. He understood that history, like war, moves in cycles, that peace is only another form of preparation. The coming years would demand not brilliance, but survival. The philosopher of Sanssouci had once sought harmony. The general of Prussia now prepared for endurance. The victories at Rossbach and Leuthen in the closing months of 1757 marked the zenith of Frederick's military genius and the high point of Prussia's brief ascendancy amid overwhelming peril. These battles were not merely triumphs of arms. They were revelations of the human will, of intellect directing chaos, of calm defying circumstance. Yet even as Europe marvelled, the king himself received the news of his fame with characteristic restraint. To his generals, he said only that success was a debt to the discipline of his soldiers. To his ministers, that peace would prove the harder conquest. The same clarity that guided his battlefield manoeuvres governed his understanding of history. He knew that fortune seldom grants victory without exacting payment later. The months following Leuthen brought both respite and responsibility. Winter covered the battlefields, and the exhausted Prussian army withdrew to quarters across Silesia and Saxony. Frederick used those rare still moments to restore order. Every regiment was reorganized, every casualty accounted for. He visited the wounded himself, speaking quietly to men who had marched with him through smoke and snow. To some he promised pensions. To others he offered only the assurance that their suffering was not in vain. His leadership had long ceased to rely on rhetoric. It rested instead upon the unspoken understanding that he shared every danger and bore every burden with them. But the victories that astonished Europe did not end the war. They were only temporary reversals of a tide that pressed relentlessly against Prussia's borders. Even in their defeat, the Austrians regrouped. The Russians, slower to move but inexhaustible, gathered their forces once more on the eastern frontier. France, humiliated at Rossbach, sent new armies into Germany to redeem its honour. In the face of this encirclement, Frederick's resolve hardened. He knew that his small kingdom could not hope to prevail through numbers or wealth. It must rely on speed, precision, and the intelligence of its command. War, in his eyes, was no longer an affair of glory, but of geometry and time. During the spring of 1758, he began a new series of manoeuvres that reflected this philosophy. His forces, trained to march and fight as extensions of a single will, moved through Bohemia and Moravia, with a discipline that foreign observers likened to clockwork. Each engagement was planned in meticulous detail, every route measured, every contingency examined. Yet beneath this mathematical order lay a growing weariness. Years of continuous campaigning had drained the nation's strength. The fields lay uncultivated, the treasury thinned, and families across Prussia counted the absent and the lost. Frederick understood the cost better than anyone. His own letters reveal a man caught between necessity and conscience. "I fight," he wrote, "because to stop is to perish. Were it in my power, I would lay down the sword this very day. But the king cannot rest while the state still breathes by his labour." Even in hardship, his intellect remained clear. He continued to reform his army in the field, introducing new tactics that emphasized flexibility over mass, initiative over rigidity. The old methods of linear warfare, with their slow, mechanical exchanges of musketry, gave way under his command to movements of speed and surprise. His troops learned to shift direction mid-battle, to adapt to terrain and circumstance. It was war not as spectacle, but as science, a living organism guided by the calculations of a single mind. This ability to combine precision with adaptability would secure his legend long after the victories themselves had faded. The moral weight of the war, however, began to press more heavily upon him. Reports of villages burned, families displaced, and fields destroyed reached him daily. His orders often included strict prohibitions against unnecessary cruelty, yet he knew that war itself was cruelty disguised as necessity. He once remarked to a confidant, "In war, humanity is a luxury, yet to abandon it is to lose one's soul." This inner conflict, the struggle to remain human while commanding destruction, became the quiet undertone of his later life. His soldiers obeyed him without hesitation, but few could imagine the silence that filled his thoughts each night after battle. At court, meanwhile, the image of Frederick grew almost mythic. Artists painted him as the warrior philosopher, calm amid smoke and gunfire, his gaze fixed upon destiny. Pamphlets across Europe described him as the saviour of the Enlightenment, a monarch who united intellect with valour. Yet the man himself rejected such praise. "They see the mask," he said, "but not the man who wears it." He knew that power, especially in war, isolates as much as it elevates. The laughter of Sanssouci had faded. The flute lay untouched. His companions were now maps, reports, and dispatches from the front. The philosopher, who had once written essays on tolerance and virtue, now wrote only orders for supply routes and troop movements. Still, the victories of Rossbach and Leuthen secured Prussia a brief and vital breathing space. They restored the army's confidence and revived the faith of the people. They also established Frederick as a central figure in European affairs, commanding both fear and admiration. Diplomats began to seek his alliance. Writers celebrated him as the embodiment of enlightened rule. Yet he accepted neither flattery nor illusion. His sense of destiny was tempered by reason. "Greatness," he wrote, "is not in conquest, but in endurance. The world admires the flash of victory. It forgets the burden that follows." As 1758 advanced, Frederick faced the renewed alliance of Austria and Russia with undiminished resolve. He led his troops eastward once more, prepared to meet a foe more numerous and determined than before. Each campaign demanded new sacrifices, new calculations, new acts of will. The rhythm of war became his existence. March, engage, withdraw, rebuild, and march again. Yet through it all, his clarity of purpose never faltered. The philosopher king, who had once governed from the serenity of Sanssouci, had become a commander whose wisdom was measured not in words, but in the quiet steadiness with which he bore the weight of history. The battles of Rossbach and Leuthen remained his proudest moments, yet they were also his last unshadowed triumphs. Ahead lay years of exhaustion, uncertainty and loss, the slow erosion of strength that no brilliance could entirely reverse. The tide of war, though momentarily held, was beginning to turn again. As the drums of another campaign beat in the distance, Frederick knew that his struggle was no longer for glory or even for victory. It was for the endurance of Prussia itself and for the preservation of the reason and order he had spent his life defending against the chaos of the world. The brilliance of Rossbach and Leuthen had crowned Frederick with the glory of a master strategist, but as the 7 Years' War stretched onward, triumph gave way to attrition. Between 1758 and 1762, the struggle ceased to resemble the elegant manoeuvres of his early campaigns. It became a contest of exhaustion, a relentless confrontation between one man's intellect and the combined weight of empires. The philosopher king, who had once governed through balance and precision, was now a commander fighting for survival, bound to the harsh rhythm of necessity. The early months of 1758 opened with renewed threats on every frontier. From the east, the Russian army, vast and implacable, advanced across the Vistula, burning towns and consuming the countryside. In the south, the Austrians regrouped under Marshal Daun, their discipline strengthened, their morale restored by promises of revenge. The French, though weakened by defeats, continued their efforts along the Rhine. Prussia was surrounded on every side, its borders stretched, its manpower depleted, its resources nearly spent. Frederick, aware of the fragility of his position, nonetheless refused to yield the initiative. He knew that inaction would mean strangulation. To remain still, he wrote, is to invite ruin. Motion, even toward danger, offers at least the chance of salvation. His plan was daring. He struck first toward the east, marching against the Russians near Zorndorf in August 1758. The field, flat and broken by swamps, became one of the bloodiest of the war. The heat was suffocating, the air filled with smoke and dust. Frederick's army, outnumbered, met the Russians head-on in a savage confrontation that defied his usual precision. Lines dissolved, formations crumbled, and the battle devolved into chaos. Frederick himself rode among the ranks, rallying men who were near collapse. At one point his horse was shot from under him. He rose, seized another, and continued issuing orders. By nightfall, the field was strewn with corpses, Prussian and Russian alike. Neither side could claim clear victory, yet the Russians withdrew, leaving Frederick to hold the ground. He called it a day of blood without triumph. The war dragged on, each campaign consuming what little strength the state retained. Every year, new armies of Austria and Russia poured into Prussian territory, and every year Frederick fought them back by sheer will and manoeuvre. In 1759, at Kunersdorf, his luck nearly ended. There, the combined forces of Austria and Russia confronted him in overwhelming numbers. The day began with optimism. His initial assaults carried the heights, but by afternoon, confusion spread through the ranks. The enemy counterattacked with ferocity, and the Prussian lines broke. The king watched his army disintegrate under the weight of superior force. He tried to rally them, but chaos overwhelmed discipline. When the sun set, the field was lost, his army shattered, and Frederick himself barely escaped capture. That night, alone and broken, he wrote one of the most sombre letters of his life. "All is lost," he confessed. "I shall not survive the ruin of my country. Adieu, forever." For the first time, he had faced the full measure of despair. Yet even in that moment, the instinct of survival returned. By dawn, he began again to rebuild. Within days, he gathered the remnants of his army, restored order, and issued new directives. He refused resignation, declaring that the duty of a king was to outlast fortune. "I must fight," he told his officers, "until they bury me beneath the last stone of the last fortress." The years that followed were a test of endurance beyond measure. The Prussian state, drained of men and money, depended on Frederick's constant vigilance. He rode from front to front, inspecting fortresses, writing orders, dictating letters to ministers, and managing every detail of the war. He slept little, ate sparsely, and lived among his troops, sharing their hardships. His health began to fail. Gout crippled his hands, insomnia hollowed his eyes. But his mind remained lucid, precise, relentless. He no longer fought for victory, but for equilibrium, for the simple preservation of existence. In Berlin, the mood darkened. News of defeats and devastation spread fear among the people. Yet even then, Frederick refused to abandon his capital. When enemy forces approached in 1760, he rode out to meet them at Torgau, where another brutal battle ensued. The field was chaos once more, forests, rivers, and smoke blending into confusion. The Austrians fought stubbornly, and the Prussians suffered terrible losses. By nightfall, victory hung in the balance. Frederick, wounded and exhausted, led one final assault. Against all odds, the Austrian lines broke. It was a costly triumph, 12,000 Prussians dead or wounded. But it saved his kingdom from collapse. When he returned to camp, his face was grey with fatigue. "Another such victory," he said quietly, "and I am ruined." The war had stripped him of illusion. The romantic notions of honour and glory that had once drawn him to battle were replaced by a cold acceptance of war's cruelty. He no longer spoke of destiny, only of endurance. His letters to his few surviving friends became shorter, his tone detached. Voltaire, writing from France, urged him to seek peace and return to philosophy. Frederick replied simply, "Philosophy is a luxury of those who are not besieged." The king, who had once ruled through intellect and harmony, now ruled through sheer perseverance. By 1762, the strain had reached its peak. Prussia was on the brink of exhaustion. Supplies were scarce, the treasury nearly empty, and the population worn by years of loss. Frederick's armies, reduced and weary, continued to fight with machine-like loyalty. And yet, when all seemed lost, fortune turned. In January of that year, Empress Elizabeth of Russia, Prussia's fiercest enemy, died suddenly. Her successor, Peter III, an admirer of Frederick, immediately ordered a ceasefire and withdrew Russian troops from the war. It was a reversal so unexpected that Frederick called it the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. The alliance of Austria and France soon faltered, and by 1763, the Treaty of Hubertusburg confirmed the restoration of peace. Frederick retained Silesia, the prize that had cost a generation's blood. Prussia emerged battered but intact, its place among the great powers secured not by expansion, but by survival. The world looked upon Frederick with awe, as if he had defied the laws of probability and history alike. Yet within him there was no triumph, only a quiet fatigue, and the knowledge that endurance, not victory, had defined his reign. The philosopher, who had once written of the harmony of order and reason, now understood that even reason must bow before the blind persistence of will. The Enlightenment monarch who had dreamed of ruling through intellect had learned that intellect alone cannot command fate. In the aftermath of the war, as he surveyed his ruined lands and diminished armies, Frederick knew that his kingdom had been saved by something simpler and harder than brilliance, by the unyielding force of necessity, and by a spirit that refused to surrender even when all logic said it should. By the beginning of 1762, Prussia seemed ready to collapse beneath the strain of 7 years of relentless war. The nation's fields lay barren, its treasury nearly empty, its people reduced to endurance rather than hope. Frederick himself, once the energetic commander riding at the head of his troops, had become gaunt, weary, and inwardly resigned. His army, still loyal, was diminished to a shadow of its former strength. The supply lines that fed it were fragile, and even the officers who had survived so many campaigns could no longer disguise their despair. "Another campaign," one of them wrote, "and we are finished." The king understood this truth more clearly than anyone. He continued to plan, to command, to feign confidence, but privately he began to prepare for the possibility that the end was near. The Austrians and Russians now occupied large parts of Prussia, their armies encamped within a few days' march of Berlin. The French pressed from the west, and what remained of Prussian resistance depended entirely on Frederick's personal direction. He rode tirelessly between front lines, shifting small detachments to fill impossible gaps, studying the movements of his enemies as if calculation alone might save what exhaustion had nearly destroyed. His correspondence from this period is stripped of ornament. "We can no longer win," he wrote to his brother, "but we must not be annihilated." The tone is not defiant, but factual, a man measuring survival in hours and miles. And then, when all seemed irretrievably lost, fate intervened with an event so sudden, so improbable, that even Frederick, the lifelong skeptic of divine intervention, could scarcely believe it. On the 5th of January 1762, news reached his headquarters that the Empress Elizabeth of Russia was dead. The message, carried across the frozen rivers by courier, was at first dismissed as rumour. But confirmation soon followed. The new emperor, Peter III, had ascended the throne, and Peter was an ardent admirer of Frederick, almost to the point of obsession. Within days, the entire Russian policy toward Prussia reversed. Orders went out to cease hostilities immediately, to withdraw Russian troops from Prussian soil, and to restore all captured territory. It was a transformation so complete that contemporaries called it the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, a phrase that would enter history as shorthand for the moment when destiny seemed to intervene to rescue a dying state. Frederick received the news in silence. Those who were present recalled that he read the dispatch twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the table. After a long pause, he said, "It is the hand of Providence, but Providence wears a strange face." For the first time in years, he allowed himself a faint smile. The Russian withdrawal not only relieved pressure on his eastern front, it also demoralized Austria and France, whose alliance now weakened under the weight of circumstance. Within weeks, Frederick regained territories that had been lost, and his troops, revived by hope, returned to the field with renewed spirit. The war, which had seemed destined to consume Prussia entirely, began to turn. Still, Frederick did not indulge in celebration. His habits, hardened by years of hardship, left no room for sentiment. He rebuilt his shattered army methodically, inspecting every regiment, replacing missing officers, and restoring supply lines. He spoke little of gratitude, less of destiny, and only of preparation. "We are reprieved," he said, "not delivered. Fate has given us breath. We must use it well." His understanding of fortune was shaped by experience. He knew that the same hand that grants reprieve can just as easily withdraw it. Indeed, when Peter III himself was soon overthrown by his wife, Catherine the Great, Frederick braced for reversal. But Catherine, pragmatic and wary of Austria's dominance, chose to maintain peace with Prussia. The miracle held. By 1763, the war that had engulfed the world finally drew to its exhausted close. Negotiations began at Hubertusburg, a small Saxon castle that became the stage for the final act of this long tragedy. The treaty signed there restored the pre-war boundaries almost exactly as they had been at the beginning, leaving the map of Europe unchanged in appearance but transformed in meaning. Prussia had neither gained new lands nor suffered territorial loss, yet its survival against such overwhelming odds elevated it to the rank of a great power. The world saw that a small, disciplined, and intelligently governed state could defy empires. Frederick's endurance had altered not geography, but history itself. When peace was announced, there were no grand parades, no triumphal arches. The people were too weary for celebration. Frederick rode back to Berlin in silence, his uniform threadbare, his face marked by the years of hardship. The crowds that gathered to see him pass did not cheer loudly. They simply removed their hats in solemn respect. They saw not a conqueror, but a survivor. The war had left the kingdom impoverished, its villages burned, its youth buried across 100 fields. Yet Frederick had preserved the state, and in that endurance lay his greatest victory. In the months that followed, he began the slow process of reconstruction. He reduced taxes, encouraged agriculture, and personally oversaw the rebuilding of towns. He issued decrees to provide bread for the hungry and aid for the widowed. His energy, astonishing even in peace, seemed to grow with necessity. Each day he rose before dawn, reviewed reports, and worked until late at night. When his ministers urged him to rest, he replied, "Rest is for those whose task is done." To him, the aftermath of war was not relief, but another duty, the transformation of survival into stability. Privately, however, Frederick carried scars that no reform could mend. His writings from the period reveal a man both lucid and detached, aware of the price of endurance. "I am weary of blood and folly," he wrote. "Men learn nothing from the past, but how to repeat it." The philosopher king, who had once believed in reason as the foundation of rule, now regarded it as fragile, easily drowned by ambition and chance. The war had not broken his mind, but it had stripped him of illusions. The Enlightenment monarch who had once sought to harmonize intellect and authority now accepted that history itself resists harmony. The miracle that had saved him became, in his reflection, not a proof of divine favor, but a reminder of life's unpredictability. He often said afterward that the only certainty in politics was uncertainty itself. And yet he remained faithful to his ideal of duty. He continued to govern with the same discipline that had guided him through battle, seeing in administration a new form of warfare, one fought against disorder, indifference, and time. As the years of peace settled over Prussia, the memory of the war began to fade for those who had not lived it. But for Frederick, it never truly ended. He had looked into the abyss and returned, not victorious, but enduring. The miracle of the House of Brandenburg was less an act of fate than a reflection of his unyielding will. The state he had nearly lost would, in time, become the foundation of a nation. The king who had stood alone against Europe would be remembered not merely for his triumphs, but for the endurance that outlasted them. When the cannons finally fell silent and the armies withdrew from their ruined encampments, Frederick returned to a land that bore the marks of exhaustion more deeply than any victory could conceal. The fields of Brandenburg and Silesia were scarred by trenches and scorched by years of marching troops. Towns that had once thrived were hollowed out by hunger and disease. In some villages, scarcely 1 man in 3 had survived the war. The king who entered Berlin in 1763 was greeted not by celebration, but by silence, a silence heavy with both reverence and fatigue. The city was draped in mourning as much as relief. Yet Frederick, whose temperament had been shaped by endurance, neither sought glory nor permitted despair. He had preserved the state. Now he would rebuild it. The years that followed were devoted not to rest, but to reconstruction. The energy that had once driven him to campaign now turned toward the administration of peace. He governed with the same rigor he had once commanded in battle, reviewing reports, dictating orders, and inspecting the smallest details of policy. Every aspect of the kingdom, from the condition of roads to the price of grain, came under his attention. He was no longer the youthful monarch who had ascended the throne with ideas of art and philosophy, nor the weary soldier of Kunersdorf who had tasted despair. He had become the embodiment of pragmatic rule, a man whose faith lay not in theories, but in results. His first concern was the restoration of agriculture. The war had left vast tracts of land untended, the population too diminished to cultivate them. Frederick responded with characteristic precision. He ordered the draining of marshes, the redistribution of seed grain, and the importation of settlers from across Europe. He granted tax exemptions to farmers willing to rebuild, provided livestock to those who had lost theirs, and established state granaries to prevent future famine. To the peasants who had once viewed him as a distant figure, he appeared as a guardian of subsistence, a ruler whose understanding of necessity matched their own. Industry and trade followed. Frederick introduced new regulations to stimulate manufacturing, built roads and canals to link distant provinces, and encouraged technical education. He understood that the strength of a state was measured not by its army alone, but by the productivity of its people. "The sword must rest," he said, "but the plough must not." Under his guidance, Prussia began to recover with a speed that astonished foreign observers. The same discipline that had sustained its soldiers now animated its labourers and merchants. Order replaced chaos. Efficiency replaced waste. The precision of war had been transposed into the rhythm of peace. His reforms extended to law and governance. The bureaucracy, once rigid and slow, was reorganised under his personal supervision. He reduced corruption by imposing strict accountability, insisting that justice must be blind to privilege. "It is not the noble who governs," he declared, "but the law." To ensure that the law remained consistent, he commissioned a codification of Prussian statutes, a vast undertaking that would occupy years. His intent was to remove ambiguity from governance, to make fairness a matter of structure rather than sentiment. In this, he differed from many rulers of his age. Where others sought moral grandeur, Frederick sought clarity. He did not trust virtue to chance. He built it into systems. Yet amid his relentless administration, traces of the philosopher king re-emerged. He resumed correspondence with Voltaire and other thinkers, and he reopened the salons at Sans Souci that had lain silent through the years of war. The gardens were restored, the music rooms reopened. Once again, in the evenings, the sounds of flutes and conversation drifted through the terraces. But even in these moments of civility, a certain gravity remained. Those who visited him noted that his laughter, though genuine, was restrained. The war had not destroyed his taste for art, but it had deepened his understanding of its fragility. He often spoke of beauty as a temporary reprieve, not a possession. "All perfection," he said, "exists only for a moment. The wise man admires, then moves on." The enlightenment that had inspired him in youth now found expression not in idealism, but in governance. Frederick considered himself an enlightened absolutist, a ruler who governed through reason rather than divine right. He abolished torture in legal proceedings, promoted religious tolerance, and reformed education. His views on religion were pragmatic. He cared less for creed than for conduct. "Let every man seek salvation in his own way," he declared, "so long as he serves the state." In this, he created a climate of relative freedom unusual for the time, one that attracted thinkers, artisans, and refugees from across Europe. Berlin began to acquire the character of a modern capital, a city of order, intellect, and ambition. Still, Frederick's conception of enlightenment was distinct from the sentimental optimism of French philosophers. His years of war had made him distrust abstractions. He admired reason, but he knew that reason alone could not change the nature of men. His writings from this period are filled with sober reflection. "Men," he observed, "speak much of liberty, but they cannot bear the weight of it. Authority is the form that keeps them from destroying themselves." Such remarks, later criticized as cynical, were in truth the conclusions of experience. He had seen both the necessity and the peril of power. To him, governance was not an ideal state, but a perpetual struggle between order and chaos, in which the ruler's task was not to perfect mankind, but to restrain its excesses. By the late 1760s, Prussia had largely recovered its stability. The treasury was replenished, trade revived, and the army restored to its disciplined strength. The young officers who had once marched through fire with Frederick were now aging veterans, their loyalty deepened by shared endurance. The state, forged in war and refined in administration, had become a model of efficiency. Foreign visitors remarked that everything in Prussia seemed to function by design. Its soldiers marched in perfect step, its farmers followed schedules as precise as clockwork, its officials worked without pause. What others saw as rigidity, Frederick regarded as harmony. Yet beneath this order, he sensed the limits of his achievement. He had rebuilt what war had destroyed, but he had also bound his nation to the system that bore his image, strong, efficient, but unyielding. His reforms had created a structure that would outlast him, yet it was one sustained by his own vigilance. He sometimes wondered whether, when he was gone, it would hold or crumble. In his solitude at Sans-Souci, he wrote, "A state is but a reflection of its ruler. When the light fades, so too does the reflection." The years of reconstruction brought Frederick neither peace nor weariness, but a quiet understanding of his place in the continuum of power. He had fought, endured, and rebuilt. The philosopher had become a realist, the conqueror a caretaker. What remained now was not ambition, but legacy, the slow, deliberate shaping of what would endure when he could no longer guide it. In the gardens of Sans-Souci, amid the ordered terraces and the still fountains, he found not joy, but a kind of completion. The kingdom he had inherited in discipline and defended in war had now been restored by reason. It stood as his final argument that the will of one mind sustained through adversity could impose order upon the disorder of the world. As the years advanced, the brilliance that had once surrounded Frederick's reign softened into something quieter, more austere. The great king of Europe, whose intellect and endurance had reshaped the continent, now moved through the long corridors of Sans-Souci as an aging monarch, still alert, still commanding, but increasingly solitary. The weight of decades sat heavily upon him. The sound of marching armies had faded into memory, replaced by the measured tick of administration and the slow rhythm of reflection. His life had become a mirror of the state he had built, disciplined, efficient, and marked by restraint. Yet beneath this surface calm there lingered the faint melancholy of a man who had outlived his age. By the early 1770s, Frederick was in his 60s, his body frail from years of relentless labour and illness, but his mind remained sharp and exact. He rose before dawn, as he always had, working at his desk until late into the night. Every morning his secretaries found new instructions written in his hand, revisions to laws, corrections to reports, notes on foreign affairs. His ministers often complained that the king governed too closely, but he would not loosen his grip. "A king," he said, "is a sentinel. The moment he sleeps, the state is plundered." It was not pride that drove him, but habit. Rulership, for Frederick, was no longer an act of will, but an instinct. Yet despite his continued activity, he began to withdraw from the world he had so long dominated. Many of the figures who had defined his youth were gone. Voltaire had died in 1778, and with him passed one of the last voices that could speak to Frederick as an equal. His circle of companions grew smaller, his evenings quieter. The salons of Sans-Souci no longer rang with debate or music. Their guests were scholars, officers, and a few trusted friends. He kept company with his greyhounds, who followed him faithfully from room to room. When courtiers found this eccentric, he replied gently, "They have never betrayed me." The solitude of age brought with it an unusual clarity. Freed from the illusions of ambition, Frederick began to see his own legacy with dispassionate eyes. He had secured Prussia's place among the great powers, yet he questioned whether greatness was truly a blessing. "The state is strong," he wrote, "but men remain weak. I have given them order, but not virtue." He understood that discipline could sustain a nation, but it could not ennoble it. His reforms had built efficiency. They had not eased the hardness of life. In this he felt both satisfaction and regret. His temperament, shaped by duty, allowed no self-pity, but his reflections often carried a tone of quiet resignation. Physically, the marks of labour were unmistakable. Years of riding in cold weather, of sleeping little and eating sparingly, had bent his frame. His hands, once steady enough to write fine letters or play the flute with delicate precision, had grown thin and tremulous. His face, drawn and lined, still carried the piercing eyes that had unnerved ministers and inspired soldiers. Visitors described him as austere yet courteous, his voice dry and measured. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it was with a gentleness that betrayed the humanity beneath the iron surface. Those who expected grandeur were instead met with simplicity. His uniform was plain, his table modest, his palace unadorned. The luxury of power had never tempted him, and in age it seemed almost to embarrass him. The Europe around him was changing once more. The Enlightenment, which had inspired his youth, was giving way to new ideas, more emotional, more radical. In France, philosophers spoke of liberty and equality with a passion that unsettled the old order. Frederick watched these developments with skepticism. He admired reason, but he feared the chaos that reason, when unbound, could unleash. "Philosophy," he said, "is good for the ruler, dangerous for the mob." He saw in the rising enthusiasm of reform a threat to stability, the very virtue upon which he had built his state. In his correspondence, he warned younger rulers that freedom without discipline would lead to ruin. His own enlightenment had always been tempered by caution, by the conviction that the human heart must be governed as firmly as the body politic. In his later years, Frederick continued to expand his territories through diplomacy rather than war. The first partition of Poland in 1772 brought new lands to Prussia, rich, fertile regions that extended his dominion northward. He justified the act as a measure of necessity, balancing power among the empires. To his critics, it was the cold logic of politics. To him, it was the fulfillment of duty. "If we do not act," he wrote, "others will, and less justly." The partition revealed the persistence of his realism, a worldview in which morality was measured by consequence. Yet even as he acted with firmness, he did not conceal his distaste for conquest. "I have taken what is useful," he said, "not what is glorious." Sans Souci, once the lively symbol of his intellect, became in these years a place of reflection and ritual. The king walked its gardens daily, his cane tapping softly on the gravel paths. He paused often before the statues of philosophers and poets, silent companions of a fading world. The terraces, once alive with conversation, now echoed only with the sound of wind through the trees. In those moments, Frederick seemed to live between two times, the past, filled with the urgency of command, and the future, which he knew would proceed without him. "Everything changes," he said once to a visitor. "Only duty does not." In his solitude, he began to write again, producing essays on politics, history, and human nature. These writings lack the vigour of youth, but possess a calm lucidity, the clarity of a man who has ceased to expect perfection. He wrote of leadership as a burden rather than a privilege, of reason as a fragile light that must be shielded from both ignorance and zeal. He no longer believed in the reform of mankind, but he still believed in the necessity of governance. The task of the ruler, he concluded, is not to make men happy, but to prevent them from destroying themselves. By the end of the decade, Frederick had become a figure of paradox, a monarch admired across Europe, yet largely alone, a man of reason living in an age turning towards sentiment, a symbol of endurance whose strength had begun to fade. His reign, which had begun amid rebellion and brilliance, was drawing slowly toward its quiet conclusion. Still, each morning he rose to the same routine, reviewed the same reports, and issued the same precise orders. Habit had become his refuge, discipline his consolation. In the evenings he walked among his dogs, speaking softly to them as the sun sank behind the terraces of Sanssouci. The philosopher king, who had once commanded empires, now ruled only himself, but he ruled that realm completely. In the twilight of his reign, Frederick lived as one who had already entered history, yet remained bound to the duties of the present. Age had narrowed his world to the palace of Sanssouci and the routines that had sustained him for a lifetime. His body had grown frail, his gait slow, his breath laboured by chronic illness, but his mind retained its sharpness, his will its iron steadiness. The courtiers who served him found him unchanged in discipline, still rising before dawn, still dictating letters, still scrutinising every report that crossed his desk. He lived not as a man at rest, but as a sentinel who refused to leave his post. By the 1780s, Frederick had reigned for 4 decades. His once restless energy had turned inward into reflection and quiet perseverance. His correspondence reveals a deepening awareness of mortality, not as tragedy, but as fact. "The body decays," he wrote, "but the duty remains until the last breath." He no longer sought to expand his dominion or to reform his people. What occupied him now was the maintenance of order, the daily correction of inefficiency, the preservation of what he had built. He often said that governing was like tending a garden. It required constant attention, even when the soil had long ceased to surprise. The burdens of age did not spare him the demands of politics. Europe was again shifting beneath its rulers. In the West, the old alliance of monarchies trembled under the pressure of new ideas: liberty, equality, and the sovereignty of reason unbound from kings. Frederick observed these developments from a distance, sceptical but curious. He admired reason as an instrument of governance, but he distrusted its transformation into revolution. Philosophy, he warned, is a fine lantern, but it must not set fire to the house. The irony was not lost on him that he, once the champion of the Enlightenment, now stood as one of its last conservative guardians. The physical decline that had begun in his 60s grew more severe. His gout worsened, his legs swollen and stiff, forcing him to walk with difficulty. The pain in his chest returned in the cold months, and breathing became laborious. Yet he concealed his suffering from those around him, refusing sympathy. To one concerned attendant he said, "A king has no right to illness. His body belongs to the state." He continued to ride when he could, inspecting troops in the courtyard, his small figure wrapped in a worn military coat. To his soldiers he remained the image of perseverance, an old man who would not yield even to time. In those final years, the rhythms of Sanssouci were subdued and ritualized. He dined alone more often, reading reports while he ate, the table set with simplicity. His evenings were quiet, devoted to writing or to solitary walks among the terraces. The gardens he had designed decades earlier had grown into full maturity, their trees casting long shadows across the gravel paths. He often paused before the marble statues of philosophers, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, Voltaire, figures who had once inspired him, now silent companions to his aging thoughts. To one visitor he remarked softly, "I have lived long enough to see that all wisdom is imperfect." He retained to the end a precise interest in military affairs. New recruits were drilled under his watchful eye. He continued to review manoeuvres and issue corrections in his sharp, concise handwriting. But there was no longer the fervour of earlier years. The once daring strategist had become a custodian of discipline. He no longer believed in war as instrument or glory. "I have seen too much of it," he said. "It consumes what it claims to defend." The soldier who had conquered Silesia and faced the armies of Europe now regarded war as a failure of intellect, a confession that reason had yielded to passion. His last companionship came from his dogs, the greyhounds that followed him faithfully through the halls of Sanssouci. They were his silent court, his comfort in solitude. He spoke to them as others might to old friends, and when one died, he had it buried near the terrace. He requested that, when his own time came, he too should rest beside them. "They have been true to me," he said, "more than men often are." In the summer of 1786, his health declined sharply. The once tireless monarch could no longer mount a horse or climb the stairs unaided. Still, he refused to take to his bed. He worked from a chair at his desk, surrounded by the same maps, letters, and documents that had shaped his life. On the evening of August 16th, he dismissed his attendants early, asking for silence. The next morning, as dawn broke over the vineyards of Sanssouci, the servants found him slumped in his chair, the pen fallen from his hand. He had died as he had lived, at work, in solitude, without ceremony. The news of his death spread quickly across Europe. In Berlin, the bells tolled softly, and people gathered in the streets in quiet mourning. There were no grand processions, no ornate displays of grief. In accordance with his wishes, he was buried simply, without fanfare, near the graves of his beloved dogs on the terrace of Sanssouci. His tomb bore no elaborate inscription, only his name and the dates of his life. Yet the simplicity of his burial became in time a greater monument than marble could have provided. Frederick left behind a kingdom transformed. When he had ascended the throne 46 years earlier, Prussia had been a modest state of soldiers and fields. When he died, it was a great power, disciplined, prosperous, and respected throughout Europe. He had given it form and coherence, shaping it not by sentiment, but by intellect. His armies, his administration, his code of law, all bore the imprint of his mind. Yet the cost of that creation was solitude. The man who had governed so rationally had lived without intimacy. The ruler who had commanded nations had never found rest. In the years that followed, his successors would imitate his methods, but seldom his spirit. Some admired his precision, others his iron will, but few understood the inner restraint that had guided both. For Frederick, power had never been about domination. It was about control, first of oneself, then of circumstance. His reign, with all its contradictions, stood as both model and warning. That reason can command history, but cannot escape it. And so the philosopher who became a general, the general who became a king, passed quietly from the world he had shaped. His flute was silent, his garden still, his empire intact. The terraces of Sanssouci remained as he had left them, orderly, harmonious, and serene beneath the sun. There, amid the symmetry of stone and vine, the story of Frederick the Great reached its final measure, a life that had begun in discipline and ended in contemplation, leaving behind a legacy of endurance that would outlast the age of kings itself. When Frederick's body was laid to rest on the terrace of Sanssouci, a profound stillness seemed to fall upon the kingdom he had ruled with such relentless purpose. For a time, Prussia itself appeared to hold its breath, unsure how to move without the will that had governed every detail of its being. Ministers continued their routines, officers inspected regiments, and the machinery of the state turned on as if guided by habit rather than inspiration. It was a strange calm, neither grief nor celebration, but the quiet that follows the end of something vast. Those who had served him for decades found it difficult to believe that the presence, which had filled their lives so completely, could be gone. Frederick's nephew and successor, Frederick William II, inherited not only the throne, but a system of governance so rigidly organized that it functioned almost without personality. The state Frederick had built was a machine of discipline, its principles embedded in law, its rhythm maintained by bureaucracy and army alike. Yet what it lacked now was the living consciousness that had once directed it. Under the new king, the tempo of rule slowed, the precision softened, and the energy of reform gave way to ceremony and indulgence. The efficiency remained, but the vision dimmed. It was as though Prussia had become a vast clock that continued to tick, unaware that its maker had departed. Across Europe, however, Frederick's legend began to grow even as his system began to age. Historians and philosophers wrote of him as the archetype of the enlightened monarch, a ruler who had united intellect with power. In Paris, his name was spoken with reverence by those who saw in him a symbol of reason governing authority. In Vienna, he was remembered as the formidable adversary who had humbled empires. In London, he was admired as the ally whose endurance had held the balance of the continent. The image of Frederick the Great took shape quickly, a title born of respect as much as of astonishment. Yet the man himself, had he lived to hear it, would have found such praise excessive. Greatness, he had once said, is a word for posterity, not for truth. Within Prussia, the memory of Frederick became both inspiration and burden. His reign had established the foundations of a disciplined state, but it had also created expectations impossible to sustain. His successors inherited not only his institutions, but also his shadow. Every decision was compared to his, every failure judged against his endurance. The army, his proudest creation, continued to drill with the same precision, its blue-coated soldiers marching in lines that seemed to echo his presence. But without his guiding intellect, the perfection of form began to replace the vitality of purpose. It was as if the instrument he had tuned so finely continued to play, but without the melody he had composed. The people too remembered him with complex feeling. To the peasants and townsfolk, he was not the philosopher king of the salons, but the stern guardian who had demanded much and given stability in return. Old veterans of his wars spoke of him with a kind of quiet reverence, recalling how he had ridden among them in the mud and smoke, how he had shared their rations and never asked of them what he did not bear himself. To them, he was our Fritz, the soldier king who had lived as simply as they did, and whose word, once given, never faltered. Among the common people, the memory of his fairness outlasted the fear of his authority. They remembered not his victories alone, but his presence, distant, yet constant, austere, yet dependable. Europe in the years after Frederick's death began to change with a speed and violence no king could have foreseen. The Enlightenment, once a philosophy of moderation, ignited into revolution. The French monarchy fell, and with it the old order that Frederick had both served and transcended. Armies of new republics marched under banners that proclaimed liberty and equality, the very ideals that he had once admired in thought but feared in practice. The continent he had held in balance descended into upheaval, and the disciplined world of courts and treaties was replaced by the chaos of ideology. In this storm, Prussia's role shifted. The state Frederick had forged through intellect and will now stood as a bastion of order in an age of disorder, admired for its stability even as it struggled to remain unchanged. As the century closed, observers began to look back upon Frederick's reign as the last chapter of an older world. The rational monarch, ruling through law and merit, seemed almost a figure of myth amid the new politics of emotion and mass upheaval. Philosophers wrote of him as a bridge between two eras, the culmination of absolutism and the precursor of modern governance. His belief that the ruler was the first servant of the state anticipated a future in which power would be judged not by birth, but by function. Yet his very success in creating an efficient state had also made it vulnerable to rigidity. What he had built for endurance would, in time, struggle to adapt. His model of governance, designed for control, would resist the flexibility that the new age demanded, and yet the idea of Frederick endured. His image hung in the offices of generals and ministers, a reminder of duty and precision. His maxims on leadership were copied into manuals, his campaigns studied in academies. Napoleon Bonaparte, who rose to power in the generation after his death, carried Frederick's portrait and read his writings on strategy with reverence. To that new conqueror, Frederick was the example of intellect commanding force, the rare man who had turned thought into victory. In a paradox that history often repeats, the philosopher who had feared revolution became the teacher of its greatest general. In the hearts of his people, his legacy remained personal. In the small villages of Brandenburg, old soldiers told their grandchildren stories of the old Fritz, who had once passed through their towns on horseback, who had spoken with soldiers and citizens alike, who had endured hardship without complaint. They remembered his sharp eyes, his quiet voice, his relentless fairness. To them, he was not a symbol of empire, but of character. The power he had wielded seemed distant. The example he had set remained near. By the end of the century, Prussia stood transformed, strong, disciplined, but no longer inspired. The man who had built its structure was gone, but his presence lingered in every institution, every regiment, every habit of the national mind. He had given his kingdom not only strength, but a temperament, the habit of precision, the belief in order, the conviction that duty was the measure of worth. These traits would shape not only Prussia's future, but that of the nation that would one day grow from it. And so, as Europe moved toward the dawn of a new and turbulent age, Frederick's legacy remained like the faint echo of a distant march, steady, measured, and indelible. His was not a reign of sentiment, nor a vision of perfection. It was the labour of a single mind imposing coherence on a disordered world. In the century to come, the world would remember him as both builder and warning, the man who proved that intellect could shape destiny, but also that destiny, once shaped, could never again be fully mastered. Time has a way of softening the edges of power. The harsh commands of rulers, the noise of their wars, and the rigour of their rule fade into the stillness of remembrance. What remains are outlines, shapes of intention and consequence that history arranges into meaning. So it was with Frederick of Prussia. In the generations that followed his death, his presence ceased to be that of a man and became that of an idea. To some, he was the embodiment of intellect enthroned, to others, the cold image of authority perfected. Yet behind both legends lay a singular truth. He had lived not for grandeur, but for order, not for dominion, but for the endurance of the state. His tomb at Sanssouci became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Visitors came from across Europe to stand before the simple slab of stone that bore only his name. They expected solemn majesty, but found humility instead. A king buried beside his dogs, overlooking the gardens he had built with his own design. The terraces, with their vineyards and statues, seemed to reflect his mind, structured, balanced, and serene. Even in death, Frederick remained what he had been in life, a man who sought harmony in all things, yet found it most fully in solitude. In the century that followed, his image evolved with the times that remembered him. To the romantic generation of the early 19th century, he appeared as a figure of reason amid the passions that had torn Europe apart. His austerity, once seen as severity, was reinterpreted as discipline. His skepticism, once regarded as detachment, as wisdom. When Prussia rose again to prominence under new rulers and faced the upheavals of Napoleon's wars, Frederick's example was invoked as a model of resilience. Soldiers carried his maxims into battle, and officers studied his campaigns as if they were sacred texts. Even Napoleon himself, whose conquests seemed to eclipse all that came before, confessed admiration for the man he called the first of the moderns. Yet as the 19th century advanced, the image of Frederick began to divide. To some, he represented the noble ideal of enlightened rule, reason guiding power, intellect restraining passion. To others, he became the symbol of the militarism that would later define the Prussian state. The very precision that had preserved his kingdom through chaos now appeared as the seed of a harsher order. Historians debated his legacy. Was he the philosopher who served humanity through governance, or the strategist who made efficiency a substitute for mercy? In truth, he was both, and neither. He had not sought to inspire empires, but to preserve a fragile one. His motives, though stern, had never been cruel. If his state became an instrument of discipline, it was because he had built it from the necessity of survival, not from the desire for domination. In the quieter moments of reflection, those who studied his life came to understand that Frederick's greatness lay not in the scale of his achievements, but in the unity of his mind. He was, above all, consistent, a man whose actions followed his reason without deviation. From youth to age, through rebellion, war, and reform, he had remained faithful to a single principle, that power must serve order, and order must serve reason. Even his skepticism, which some mistook for cynicism, was born not of bitterness, but of understanding. He had seen too much of human frailty to believe in perfection, but he had seen enough of human endurance to believe in effort. The 20th century would alter the meaning of his legacy once more. As Europe's wars returned with new ferocity, and as Prussia itself was absorbed into the greater tides of nationalism and destruction, Frederick's memory was both claimed and distorted. Some used his name to glorify conquest, forgetting the restraint that had guided his wars. Others condemned him as the origin of a tradition of obedience that would later serve darker ends. But history, though it may pass judgment, cannot erase complexity. The same Frederick who drilled armies into precision also abolished torture and proclaimed religious tolerance. The same ruler who conquered Silesia also rebuilt its farms, founded its schools, and protected its poor. He was a man who understood that strength without justice was tyranny, and justice without strength was frailty. In the end, the image that endures is not that of a conqueror standing above his troops, but of an old man walking slowly among his gardens at dusk, his uniform plain, his cane tapping softly on the gravel, his gaze moving across the terraces to the horizon, where Prussia stretched beyond sight. There, perhaps, he felt the stillness that had eluded him in life, the peace that comes not from victory, but from completion. He had given his nation the form of his mind, ordered, resilient, and rational. Whether that form would serve the world for good or ill was no longer his to decide. The philosopher in him had long understood that the works of men, like the empires they build, are instruments of time, not of eternity. Today, more than 2 centuries after his death, Frederick's figure remains both distant and familiar. He stands at the intersection of thought and command, a reminder of the fragile line between reason and power. His life offers no simple lesson, no moral triumph. It is a meditation on the cost of greatness, on the solitude of duty, and on the endurance of intellect amid the shifting chaos of history. He belonged to an age when kings still believed they could shape destiny through the force of will. Yet in his skepticism, he anticipated a world that would one day question that very faith. As the centuries pass, the memory of Frederick the Great persists not as monument, but as measure, the measure of what discipline can achieve and of what it can never redeem. He was both instrument and servant of his age, a man who mastered history even as he was mastered by it. The philosopher became a general, the general a king, and the king, in his final solitude, became once more a philosopher, one who had learned that to govern men is to confront the limits of reason itself. And so, in the quiet gardens of Sanssouci, where the sunlight still falls evenly across the terraces he loved, Frederick remains present, not in the grandeur of empire, but in the calm geometry of design, not in the echo of drums, but in the still rhythm of thought. There, the restless energy of his life finds its answer in silence. There, the king who became a general rests without care, without pretense, and without illusion, having given to history not the perfection of reason, but the endurance of order.